I moved into the apartment on a gray Tuesday. The kind of day that makes everything feel cheap and hollow, even the sun struggling through the clouds. It was on the third floor of a building that smelled faintly of mildew and old cigarette smoke. The kind of place you look at and think, this will do, I guess. I didn't expect much. I just needed somewhere cheap while I figured out the city. The job. Life. The lease was short, the rent almost laughable, and the landlord had a nervous twitch that made me uneasy the moment I shook his hand. He said, "Oh, just a heads up. Your roommate's a bit private." I nodded, not really listening. I'd lived with strangers before. You get used to odd habits, weird schedules, the quiet hum of tension that fills shared spaces. I unpacked my boxes slowly, letting the apartment's silence settle over me. The walls were bare, the floor creaked under my weight, and the window rattled when the wind pressed against it. I tried not to notice that everything seemed just a little too small, just a little too off. He appeared later that evening. I didn't even know he was home until I heard the door close softly down the hall. At first, I caught only the echo of a voice, low and mumbled, talking to someone, or maybe to himself. He had his back to me when I stepped into the kitchen, slicing vegetables with a precision that made me stop mid-step. "Hey," I said, trying for casual. "I'm your new roommate, Alex." He didn't turn around immediately. When he finally looked at me, his eyes felt too steady, too sharp. "Jamie," he said. That was all. Just Jamie. He nodded once, briefly, like we had completed some unspoken ritual. He didn't smile. Not once. And there was this faint tremor in the air around him, something I couldn't place. A presence you notice before you even know it exists. At first, I told myself it was normal. Everyone's a little weird. Everyone has habits you don't understand. But it didn't take long for me to notice the strange things. For one, he left the apartment at odd hours. Not just late-night errands or work shifts, but vanishing entirely for stretches of time that made no sense. Sometimes he'd be gone for an hour, sometimes the entire night. He never answered when I asked where he was going. "I have things to do," he'd say. That was it. No elaboration, no lie, just that simple final statement. I started keeping track in my head, trying to find a pattern. Nothing. One night I stayed awake, listening, watching. The street outside was quiet, empty, but I could hear him moving in the hallway. Not the usual sound of a person walking, but something lighter, almost deliberate, careful, as if he didn't want to touch the floor. I thought maybe I was imagining it. The apartment itself seemed to respond to him. Rooms I hadn't entered yet felt colder when he was around. The bathroom smelled faintly of iron even when clean, and sometimes, when I passed his door, I swore I saw shadows flicker behind the curtainless window. Nothing that could be explained, not really, and yet enough to make my stomach knot tight. He was meticulous. His side of the apartment was immaculate, everything in its place. Sometimes I would come home to find his bed made perfectly, the sheets taut and smooth like no one had slept in them, and yet I could hear the faint hum of the heater coming from his room at odd times. He slept, I assumed, but the timing didn't make sense. We barely spoke, mostly small talk, the kind that disappears quickly. But even then, I noticed the oddities. He avoided mirrors, kept lights low, and had this habit of staring at the ceiling for minutes at a time. When he spoke, his voice carried a strange calmness, a precision, like he was measuring every word before releasing it. And the phone. The phone was never silent. Not the ringing, it was something else. He kept it close, constantly checking it, muttering to himself sometimes, words I couldn't understand. I wondered if it was work, friends, family, but no one ever called while I was around. It was always quiet, and yet he listened. I started to feel uneasy, a creeping sensation that he was aware of me more than I realized. Not in a friendly way, not in a caring way, but in a quiet, calculating observation. I'd enter the kitchen, thinking he was asleep, and catch him sitting upright in the dark, eyes fixed on me, and then he'd smile just enough to make me doubt myself. I tried not to let it get to me. I told myself it was paranoia. Everyone has quirks. Everyone has secrets. Maybe this one was just private. But that first week, the little things started piling up. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. The soft scrape of shoes on the floor at 3 in the morning. A smell, faint and metallic that would linger near his room and vanish when I checked. I caught him once looking at me while I showered. He didn't knock, didn't make a sound, just stood there for a second before disappearing. I couldn't tell if it was intentional or if he didn't realize I saw him. The thought made my skin crawl. I started locking the bathroom door even when he wasn't home. Meals became strange, too. I cooked, he ate, but never at the same time. I'd hear him opening the fridge in the dead of night, putting things back, rearranging. I began checking the cabinets, counting cans, noticing tiny changes. Sometimes a jar would be turned around. Sometimes a piece of bread I thought I'd left on the counter would be gone. I didn't know why it bothered me so much. Maybe it was the lack of control. Maybe the feeling that someone else's world existed right beside mine, moving silently, imperceptibly, and yet inescapably. And then there were the noises. Not normal apartment noises, nothing a creaky pipe or settling wood could explain. Soft taps at the window, whispers in the hallway, a shuffle behind the walls. I tried to dismiss them, rationalize them, but the timing always coincided with him. Always. By the end of the week, I was exhausted, tense, feeling like I was living next to a ghost who was very much alive. And yet, when I confronted him, when I tried to ask what was happening, he would just smile that thin, unreadable smile and say, "I told you, I have things to do." Sometimes late at night, I would lie awake on my bed, listening to him move around in the shadows. And then I realized I didn't know him at all. I didn't know if he slept, ate, existed in the ways normal people do, and the thought made my chest tighten. One night I woke to the sound of his door closing, quiet, gentle, too gentle. I figured he was leaving like he often did, but the hallway was empty. I checked the staircase, no one. The street below was silent, only the faint hum of a distant car. He had vanished, just like that, and I hadn't even realized it until hours later. When I told myself to relax, to sleep, I noticed something worse. The apartment felt emptier than usual, not just because he was gone, but because his absence left a hollow that was almost physical. I could feel the space he occupied in some unnameable way, like the walls themselves missed him, and I knew, even then, that this was only the beginning. There was something in him, something I couldn't understand, something that didn't belong in the normal rhythm of life, something waiting. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into a stranger's habits. But deep down, I knew I wasn't, because I wasn't the only one noticing. After that first week, I started noticing the phone. Not my phone, his. It was always on the small table next to his bed, always silent, but somehow it carried a presence. It wasn't ringing when it mattered, not like normal phones do. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I could hear it buzzing faintly, almost beneath the floorboards. Like the apartment itself was humming, warning me. He received calls at odd hours. Late enough that the city outside seemed dead, that the air smelled of damp concrete and exhaust. Sometimes he would answer, sometimes he wouldn't. But I began to notice a pattern. When he answered, his voice changed, soft, almost melodic, the kind of tone that makes you want to sink into it, except there was a hollow edge. A silence underneath that wasn't there before. I wanted to leave him alone, wanted to respect whatever privacy he had, but curiosity gnawed at me. By the third night, I couldn't resist. I waited until he left his door cracked open, a sliver of light spilling into the hall. I followed him silently. He walked through the apartment like a ghost. His feet made almost no sound, gliding across the floor. I followed down the stairwell, careful not to make a sound. Outside, the street was empty, drenched in a fog that seemed to thicken around him, swallowing the sounds of the city. He didn't go far, just across the street to the small, shuttered convenience store. But there he paused. I could see him through the fog, staring at the glass door. And then his phone rang. I couldn't see who it was, and maybe I didn't want to. But the way he held the phone, cradling it, talking softly, made my stomach knot. He muttered words I couldn't hear, his lips barely moving, and then he listened, tilting his head, nodding, his body perfectly still except for the tiny trembling of his fingers. I wanted to call out, to ask who he was talking to, but something stopped me, something instinctual. A warning, sharp and immediate, that this was not a conversation for me to witness. I took a step back, almost stumbling, and he turned. For a second, I thought he saw me. I thought his eyes locked on mine. But then he glanced down at the phone, whispered something, and walked away. The fog swallowed him again, and I was left frozen on the sidewalk, heart pounding. I returned to the apartment, trying to act normal. He was already back, sitting in the dark as if he'd never left. The phone lay next to him. I asked him casually, "Everything okay?" He didn't look at me. "I told you. I have things to do." And that was it. No explanation. Nothing, but the calls didn't stop. Every night at unpredictable times, the phone would vibrate or buzz softly, and I noticed it. Sometimes the calls came when he wasn't even home. Sometimes I heard it ringing faintly in the apartment while he slept. Or at least I assumed he slept. I started keeping a log, dates, times, duration. Nothing made sense. Sometimes the calls lasted only seconds. Other times they stretched into the early hours of the morning, and every time he would answer in that same strange melodic tone. I could feel it resonate even from the other side of the room. One night I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know. I grabbed my coat, my phone, and followed him again. He left quietly, moving like he was part of the shadows themselves. I stayed far enough back, careful to blend with the night. He stopped at a park this time, the kind with flickering streetlights and rusted benches. The fog seemed thicker here, curling around the lampposts, swallowing the edges of the world. He crouched behind a bench, holding the phone up, speaking softly. And then he did something I couldn't explain. He pressed the phone to the ground. Not to his ear, not to speak, but just held it there. And I saw it. The screen lit up, casting a pale blue light, and the sound came. Not a voice. Not words. Just whispers. Hundreds of them. Layered, overlapping, incoherent, and yet unmistakable. They weren't coming from the phone. They were coming from him, from the space around him. I stumbled backward, heart racing, and the sudden noise of a dropped branch made him snap his head toward me. His eyes were sharper now, glinting in the fog. And then, in a movement too fast to follow, he vanished into the darkness. Just gone. I stayed there for what felt like hours, frozen, listening to the empty whispers fading into the night. Eventually, I returned to the apartment, my mind reeling. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Over the next few days, I tried to confront him. I tried to ask what was happening, what those calls were, but he avoided the question, avoided me even. When I pressed too hard, he would just smile, that thin, unreadable smile, and whisper, "Some things are not for you." I started noticing other changes, too. Objects in the apartment moved when I wasn't looking. Items I swore I left on my desk were gone, only to reappear somewhere else. The air sometimes carried that metallic tang, faint but unmistakable. And the whispers. I could hear them even when he wasn't speaking. I questioned my sanity. I told myself I was imagining things, that the stress of the city and the new apartment was playing tricks on me. But the phone never lied. I would see it light up, ringing, vibrating, and when I approached, it would go silent. No caller ID, no record. One evening, I followed him yet again. I needed answers. I watched him enter the stairwell, descend slowly, and disappear into the night. I thought I would confront him this time. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs, the street was empty. No one, not a single soul. Not him. The fog rolled in thick, and I realized something terrifying. He was never following a path. He was somewhere else, somewhere beyond the normal world. I felt it in the weight of the air, in the sudden chill that crept into my bones. When I returned to the apartment, the door was ajar. The phone sat on the table, screen glowing faintly. I picked it up. No numbers, no messages, no calls in the log, but I heard it, the faintest whisper, like a breath against my ear saying, "I see you." I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. And that's when I understood it wasn't just the phone, it was him. Wherever he went, whatever he became, it followed him. The apartment, the air, the space around him, it bent, it warped. And I was trapped inside it with him. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every time the phone buzzed, every time a shadow flickered, I felt him there, watching, waiting. And the worst part was knowing I couldn't do anything about it. He wasn't human, not fully. And the more I tried to observe, the less he became something I could understand. The night stretched on, and I lay in bed, eyes wide open, listening to the apartment breathe. Every creak, every whisper, every faint vibration of the phone made me flinch. I realized something terrible. I didn't know him at all. And worse, I didn't know if I ever would. Something had entered my life, and it wasn't leaving. It happened one morning that I woke to the apartment being wrong, too quiet. Not just quiet, but hollow. Like the air itself had been sucked out. The clock ticked, the fridge hummed faintly. But everything else, the little noises I had grown used to, were gone. I got up, expecting to find him in his room, maybe asleep, maybe just gone for one of his strange night excursions. But the room was empty. His bed was made perfectly, sheets taut like no one had ever slept there. His side of the closet was bare, nothing out of place. The apartment smelled faintly of iron, that metallic tang I had learned to associate with him. I called his name softly. No answer. I checked the living room, the kitchen, every corner of the apartment. Nothing. The phone sat on the table, screen dark. Not ringing. Not vibrating. Not a trace of the presence I had felt everywhere he went. I told myself he had left. Maybe he had a job or family emergency. Maybe he would come back. I tried to convince myself of normality, but the gnawing in my chest said otherwise. Hours passed. No sign of him? I called his phone. Straight to voicemail. Tried again. Nothing. I went outside, asked neighbors if they'd seen him. They shrugged. No one had. And that was strange. He wasn't a secretive recluse all the time. Sometimes he walked the streets, always noticed, always present. And now nothing. I called the police, explained the situation, tried to sound calm. Missing roommate. Strange habits. Unanswered calls. The officer took notes, asked routine questions. Any signs of foul play? She said. Anything unusual in the apartment? I hesitated. Should I tell them about the whispers? The shadows? The phone calls that seemed to come from nowhere? The way he moved? As if he wasn't bound by the rules of the world? I didn't. It sounded insane. The police arrived later that day. They went through the apartment systematically, opening drawers, checking the closet, even behind furniture. I followed, holding my breath. They found nothing. No sign of struggle, no note, no indication he had left suddenly. The place was immaculate, too immaculate. One of the officers frowned at a stack of papers on the desk. Anything here? I shook my head. Just bills, receipts, normal stuff, but then they noticed it. Little things I hadn't paid attention to. Odd objects tucked in corners behind the bed, inside cabinets. Small, unidentifiable things. Shards of something that looked like glass but reflected no light. Thin black threads that seemed to absorb it. Shapes that made no sense. One officer picked up a tiny figurine, twisted and warped like it had been melted and reformed into something. Wrong. What is this? He asked. I don't know, I said, voice shaking. He had habits. Strange things. He liked to keep things organized. Maybe he collected this stuff, but the objects didn't feel like collectibles. They felt alive, watching, waiting. The police left eventually after taking pictures and logging reports. They told me to stay calm, to give it time, that people disappear for reasons they can't explain, that he might turn up at a friend's place or a hospital. I stayed in the apartment that night, but I couldn't sleep. Every corner seemed different now, every shadow stretching longer, darker, colder. I kept looking at his room, at the empty bed, the untouched desk, the silent phone, and then I noticed it. A movement, subtle, almost imperceptible. The shadows themselves shifted. Behind the door, in the corner near the window, something moved, not quite solid, not quite air. A presence, watching, waiting. I wanted to leave, to run, but I was trapped in the apartment, in the space he had defined. I could feel it in my chest, in my bones. The apartment had changed. And I couldn't tell if he had taken it with him, or if he had left a part of himself behind. Over the next few days, I tried to go about life. Eat, work, shower. But the apartment was alive with absence. I would wake to the faintest sounds, scrapes across the floor, whispers I couldn't understand, the phone lighting up briefly with no calls. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to know what it was. Then the dreams began. Not nightmares exactly, just moments. Fleeting images of him, or what I thought was him. Walking through fog, always just out of reach. Standing at the edge of my vision, turning corners where no one should be. Watching me. Waiting. I started noticing small details in the apartment. The objects he left behind weren't random. There was a pattern, a sequence, almost like a map. I tried to trace it. Touching them made my fingers tingle. I felt eyes on me, even when the apartment was empty. Even when I was alone. One evening, I sat on the floor of his room, staring at the desk. Among the papers, the unidentifiable objects, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A small notebook. Its pages were filled with numbers, symbols, diagrams I didn't recognize. Tiny, precise handwriting, perfectly aligned. And on the last page, a single line, scrawled in a different, jagged hand, "You are here." Watching is the first step. My breath caught. I dropped the notebook. It hit the floor, making no sound. And I realized then I was part of whatever he had been doing. Not a roommate, not a witness. A participant, whether I wanted it or not. Days turned into a blur. I didn't leave the apartment much. I couldn't. Every time I tried, I felt the presence tighten around me like the walls themselves were pressing in. And the objects, they multiplied. Not physically, but perceptually. Every glance revealed something new, something impossible, something that should not exist in the mundane reality of my life. I called the landlord again. Tried to tell him something was wrong, but he just nodded nervously, reminded me of the lease, told me to stay calm. Sometimes people move out suddenly, he said. You'll see him again. Don't worry. But I knew he wouldn't return. Not the same. He had crossed something, stepped into a place I couldn't follow. And yet, a part of him lingered here in the apartment, in the air, in the objects, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, listening to the faintest whispers. The phone lit up briefly, then went dark. I could feel it. Him, moving through the apartment without moving. I could feel eyes on me from places that shouldn't have eyes. I realized then that he was gone. Yes, but he wasn't gone. Not really. The apartment had become a vessel, a fragment of whatever he had been. And I was trapped inside it, alone, with the echo of him everywhere. I tried to tell someone, friend, neighbor, the police, but no one would understand. They would see an empty apartment, a missing roommate, and call it a normal disappearance. They wouldn't see the objects, the whispers, the shadows. They wouldn't hear the faint hum of the phone vibrating when no one called. They wouldn't see the shape behind the corner, watching, waiting. I sat there for hours, staring at his empty room until I felt the first movement. A whisper brushing against my ear. A presence at the edge of my vision. And then, unmistakably, the sensation of him, sliding through the walls, existing somewhere beyond the ordinary, tethered to this apartment in ways I couldn't name. I began to notice that objects moved even when I wasn't looking. Chairs slightly shifted. Books fell open. Tiny figurines turned toward me. And the notebook. The notebook now appeared in different places each day, as if guiding me, teaching me something I couldn't understand. I tried to leave. Packed a bag, ran down the stairs, stepped onto the street. But the city felt different. Fog thickened unnaturally. Streets curved where they shouldn't. Sounds stretched into impossible echoes. And when I returned the next day, the apartment was unchanged. My absence ignored, his presence eternal. I began to understand in a terrifying way that he hadn't vanished in the usual sense. He had become part of something else, something that used the apartment as a bridge, a place to reach me, to reach the world in small, subtle ways. And the thought that I might never see the apartment empty again, that I might never be free of him, settled in my chest like a stone. The next night, I woke to a sound I hadn't heard before, a soft knock at the bedroom door. Weeks had passed since he vanished. Weeks in which the apartment felt heavier, darker, alive in ways I couldn't explain. I hadn't left much. Food, water, basic necessities, everything else was secondary. I was trapped, and I knew it. I tried to convince myself that time would heal this, that absence would dull the presence he had left behind. But absence, I realized, wasn't absence at all. It was a different kind of presence. One that weighed on the walls, pooled in the corners, and whispered in the shadows. It started with small sounds. A scrape across the floor at 3 in the morning. A faint whisper from the corner near his room. The soft vibration of the phone when no call came. I became hyper-aware, listening for the slightest shift, the smallest movement. And then came the knocks. At first, I ignored them, thinking they were the wind, the building settling, my mind playing tricks. But they grew persistent, deliberate, measured. 3 soft taps, pause, 2 sharp, pause, 1 long. Always coming from his room. I told myself it was impossible. He was gone. The apartment was empty. Yet the knocks continued. Night after night, I began to dread sleep, because each knock felt like a countdown, a summons I couldn't refuse. I tried to confront it once. I opened the door slowly, heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty. The bed untouched. The objects, the strange shards, the black threads, they were all there, perfectly in place. And yet I felt it, the weight, the eyes. That night I slept fitfully in the living room. Every creak of the floor made me flinch. Every shadow seemed alive, moving against the rhythm of the apartment. I thought I was imagining it until I heard a soft, almost imperceptible voice whisper my name. Jamie. I froze. Not a dream. Not imagination. Real. Close. Too close. I tried calling the police again, but I couldn't explain it. How do you describe a presence in a room? How do you explain whispers in the dark? Objects shifting when no one is there, the feeling of being watched by someone who isn't there. They would laugh. They would think I was losing my mind, so I stopped calling. I stopped trying to make sense. I stayed awake instead, watching, listening, waiting, and the knocks persisted. Always from his room, never the door. Always inside where only he could reach. Sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, always deliberate. One night, I mustered the courage to speak. "Who's there?" I whispered, voice trembling. Silence. Then the knocks began again. Slow this time, almost patient. 1, pause, 2, pause, 3, and then the faintest rustling. Like someone shifting in the shadows, I realized, with a sickening clarity, that it was him, or what he had become. Not human, not entirely. The apartment had become his vessel, and he was reaching through it. Reaching for me, I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, a manifestation of fear. Maybe the apartment itself had absorbed his presence, and I was projecting it. But the phone buzzed suddenly, startling me. A single message appeared. I never left. No sender. No number, just the words. I dropped the phone. Heart racing, breath shallow. The room was colder now, the shadows longer. And the knocking continued, as if confirming the message, as if laughing silently at my realization. I didn't sleep that night, or the next, or the one after. Each night the apartment grew stranger, more alive. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. The whispers became more distinct, like fragments of sentences I almost understood. Watching, waiting, here. Not gone! I began noticing him in the corners of my vision. A shadow that wasn't there a moment ago. A flicker of movement when I turned my head. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself I was imagining things, but deep down I knew better. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and opened his door. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the bed, the desk, the strange objects. Nothing. Empty. Yet the knocking persisted. It wasn't coming from any physical source. It was coming from everywhere. From the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The apartment itself was tapping, breathing, alive with him. And I could feel it in my chest, in my bones. The presence was no longer bound to his room. It was here, with me, inside me. I dropped to my knees, head in my hands, trying to block it out. But the whispering grew louder, overlapping now with the knocking. Jamie, watch, follow. Here, I couldn't think, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then the phone lit up again. A new message. You can't leave, I screamed, a sound I hadn't made in years. It echoed in the apartment, bouncing off walls, swallowed by shadows. And then silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. That maybe exhaustion had claimed me, that my mind had finally broken completely. But the knocking resumed, soft, deliberate, patient. 3 taps. Pause. 2. Pause. 1. And then a pause longer than any I had felt before, filled with expectation, hunger, and promise. I realized something terrible. He hadn't vanished. He had transcended the limits of a normal human life. He existed here now, in this apartment, in the air, in the objects, in the shadows, and he was waiting for me to acknowledge it fully. Weeks turned into a distorted blur. Days no longer mattered. Sunlight didn't penetrate the thickening fog of the apartment. The walls seemed to breathe. The objects multiplied, not physically but perceptually, like hallucinations that weren't quite hallucinations. I was losing track of what was real, what wasn't. And still, the knocking continued. One night, I sat on the floor, flashlight in hand, surrounded by the objects he had left behind. I spoke aloud, voice trembling, hoping for some form of release, some logic in the chaos. "Who are you? What do you want?" The response was immediate. A knock right above my head, then another on my left, then one below from the floorboards. The apartment itself seemed to pulse, to answer me. And in that moment, I understood. He was never my roommate. He was something else. Something ancient, something patient, something that had chosen this apartment as a point of contact, and me as the observer, the participant, the witness. I tried to leave. I ran to the door, flung it open, but the hallway stretched endlessly, bending, twisting. The building around me had changed. No escape, no exit. Just the apartment and the presence and the knocking, always the knocking. I collapsed back onto the floor, sobbing. The whispers overlapped now with voices I knew, neighbors, friends, strangers, echoing inside the walls. And the phone buzzed once more, a final cruel punctuation. "You see me now?" I didn't move, couldn't move, and I knew with certainty that this was only the beginning. The knocking continued. I learned, in the cold, hollow weeks that followed, that some presences never leave. Some rooms never empty themselves, and some roommates never truly move out. I sit now in the apartment, listening, waiting. The knocking comes in patterns, messages, warnings, fragments of thought that I can barely comprehend. And sometimes, I think I feel him standing just behind me, not touching, not speaking, but watching, patient, eternal. I wonder sometimes if he ever was human, or if he only appeared human to lure someone like me into understanding the impossible. The apartment breathes with him now. The walls pulse, the shadows twitch, the objects shift, and the phone still lights up. Always with no caller ID, always with the same message, variations of a truth I can't escape. I never left, and I know he never will. I didn't expect moving into a new house to feel like stepping into someone else's memories. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, like it had been waiting for someone new, waiting for me. The walls creaked under their own weight as I unpacked boxes, and the floors groaned whenever I shifted my weight. It should have felt exciting, new, beginnings, but instead it felt hollow, like the house had swallowed something that used to be alive. The first night was the worst. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows from the streetlights outside painting strange shapes on the walls. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just the way light falls when there are no curtains, just thin blinds. But then I noticed something. Movement, a silhouette, just beyond the glass of my bedroom window. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My bedroom was on the second floor. The street outside was empty, nothing but the faint hum of a passing car in the distance. And yet, there he was, a man, standing there, just staring, motionless. His eyes were impossible to see clearly in the dark, but I felt them. They burned. He didn't blink. I told myself it was a trick of the shadows, maybe a tree branch, maybe a reflection from the lamp in the hall. My rational brain clawed at every possible excuse, but I knew what I saw. I knew someone, or something, was watching me. I pulled the curtains tight and sank into my pillows, my hands trembling. I lay there, listening to the wind outside and the occasional rustle of leaves, convincing myself I had imagined it. I wanted to tell myself I had imagined it. Sleep came in fits, broken by dreams of dark shapes pressing against glass, eyes reflecting mine in unnatural ways. Morning didn't bring relief. Light felt harsh, intrusive, as though it were highlighting what the darkness had whispered. I kept checking the window, half expecting him to be gone. But the memory of that gaze lingered, sinking into my chest like a stone. Days passed, and I began noticing small things that unsettled me. The back of my neck would prickle when I passed the window, as though someone's presence followed me even when I thought I was alone. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of a shadow moving at the corner of my vision, vanishing when I turned my head. The blinds weren't disturbed. Nothing seemed out of place, yet I could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes. One evening I had just finished unpacking the kitchen when I felt it again. Standing by the window in the dim amber light of the setting sun, I thought I saw him. I froze, trying to convince myself it was the tree outside, the branches swaying. But then I saw the shape, tall, thin, impossibly still. My stomach twisted into knots. I ducked behind the counter and watched, holding my breath. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, didn't leave. I wanted to call the police, to tell someone, anyone. But even as the thought formed in my mind, I knew what would happen. They'd check the empty street, see no one, and dismiss me. New house, new stress, they'd say. You're tired. You're imagining things. And I'd be left with this dread gnawing at me, alone. Sleep became impossible. I would lie, in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining that he was still there, still outside, just waiting for the moment I fell asleep. Some nights I thought I could hear him breathing. Other nights I was certain I saw his shadow move across the blinds, even though I had locked the windows. I began avoiding the window. I didn't pull the blinds open during the day. I didn't go near it when it was dark. But somehow, it didn't matter. I could feel his presence anyway. It seeped into the edges of the room, a cold, heavy thing pressing against the walls, pressing against my skin. One night I woke to the sound of my own voice, a whisper that didn't belong to me, murmuring from the hallway. "Go away!" My heart jumped. I sat up in bed, eyes darting to the doorway. Nothing. Silence. I told myself it was a dream, a nightmare. But the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, stayed. I began noticing small details I hadn't before. A handprint in the dust on the windowsill, a faint scuff on the floor near the window. I could convince myself it was old, left from before I moved in. But something about it felt deliberate. Someone had been there, or someone had been watching me, leaving their mark without stepping inside. I tried to talk to my friends about it, but their responses were hollow, distracted. "New house jitters," they said. "You'll get used to it." But they didn't understand. This wasn't just nerves. This wasn't stress. It was something else. Something patient, waiting. I felt it when I brushed my teeth, when I poured coffee in the morning, when I read in bed. A shadow lingering just beyond vision, a presence that didn't belong to the day. The nights were the worst. The darkness seemed thicker, heavier, as though it were alive. I would lie in bed trying to count my breaths, trying to tell myself it was safe. And then I would see it, movement, just a flicker, a silhouette at the edge of the window, and the gaze, always the gaze. I began locking every door, even doors inside the house. I checked the windows obsessively, bolted and unbolted them in a rhythm that made no sense. And still, I felt him. The man in the window, watching, waiting. I never saw more than a shadow, a shape, a presence. But that was enough. Enough to make my stomach turn. Enough to make my heart pound so hard I thought it would burst. enough to make me question my own mind and wonder if I was losing it. And maybe I was. Because some nights, I swear I heard him whispering my name. Softly, low, a voice that carried through the walls. Not through the air, but through the wood and paint, through the bones of the house itself. And I would lie there, trembling, staring at the ceiling, trying not to move, trying not to breathe too loudly, because I knew he was out there. I don't know how long it has been. Days, weeks. Time has started to blur. I only know the nights and the weight of that gaze. The man in the window doesn't come closer. He doesn't leave. He just waits, silent, patient, and utterly unrelenting. I thought about moving, packing up everything, leaving, escaping, but even the thought is unbearable. Where would I go? He isn't just in the house. He's in the air, in the shadows, in the edges of my vision. I can feel him when I'm awake. And sometimes when I dream, I can feel him brushing against me, just out of reach. Tonight, as I lie in bed, I can feel it again. The presence at the window, watching, waiting. I want to scream, I want to run, but I can't. I'm frozen, trapped, staring at the dark glass, praying the shadows will hide me, praying that maybe, just maybe, it's not real. But I know it is. And I know he's still there. The days blurred into nights, and the nights, they became unbearable. I stopped trying to convince myself it was my imagination. The man in the window wasn't just a fleeting shadow anymore. He had started leaving traces. Small things, at first. But the small things were impossible to ignore. It started with the hallway. I had a narrow hall between the bedrooms and the kitchen, with dark wooden floors that creaked under every step. I began noticing footprints, not muddy, not wet, just faint impressions like someone had walked carefully, almost floating, leaving only the barest outline of a shoe behind. At first I thought it was me. Maybe I had knocked over some dust while unpacking, but I didn't go into that part of the house at night. I hadn't. The prints led from my bedroom, down the hall, and stopped right in front of the living room. No door had been opened. No lights had been on. I froze when I saw them. The room was empty. The air smelled faintly of something metallic, something cold. My hands shook as I pressed my fingers to the marks. They weren't smudged, like someone had walked through dust. They were too clean, too deliberate. That night, I slept lightly, waking every hour to check the hallway. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of movement, a flicker of a shadow that didn't belong to me. My eyes strained in the dark, searching for the figure I knew was there. And sometimes, just sometimes, I could hear it, barely audible, a soft shuffle like someone pacing, circling the rooms. Then things started moving, small items, harmless, seemingly trivial things, a book on the counter, a pair of scissors on the table, a mug that I had set on the windowsill. They weren't in the places I'd left them. I would swear they were right there, and the next moment, they weren't. I began setting little traps for myself. I would place a pen at the edge of the table, imagining it would fall if disturbed. Sometimes it would move. Not fall, not roll. It would shift slightly, almost imperceptibly. I'd watch for hours, my pulse hammering, waiting. And always, always, the sense of being observed, even when I tried to convince myself the room was empty. I stopped answering the phone calls from friends. They asked if I was settling in, if the house felt okay. I lied. I said yes, that everything was fine. Who could I tell? How could I explain the creeping, invisible weight of someone or something following me in my own home? The police would say I was paranoid, overworked, imagining it. Even the word paranoid felt terrifying. One night, it escalated. I woke to a sound I can't forget, the scraping of nails on wood, slow, deliberate, moving across the floorboards in the hallway. My bedroom door was closed, locked, yet I could hear it. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was a branch outside, a loose floorboard, anything but him. But the sound kept coming, closer, circling, then retreating as though he knew I was awake, listening. My chest tightened, my lungs refused to fill properly. I couldn't move. I couldn't call for help. I lay there trembling, watching the shadows on the walls stretch and twist in the moonlight. In the morning, I found more footprints. These were smaller, lighter, like bare feet. They started at my bedroom door and led down the hallway, stopping in front of the kitchen. I followed them slowly, each step shaking in fear. Nothing was there. No one. But the evidence was undeniable. Someone, or something, had walked through the house while I slept. I started noticing other changes. The windows, which I swore I had locked, seemed different. Sometimes they would be slightly ajar when I returned from the bathroom. The blinds, too, would shift, tilting as if someone had looked through them, careful not to make a sound. I began checking every window every time I entered a room, every time I passed a door. The exhaustion was relentless, creeping into my bones, making me shake, making me forget simple things like locking the front door. I tried leaving, just for a little while. I drove to the grocery store thinking the distance would clear my mind. But even there I felt it. Shadows lurking at the edges of my vision. Every reflective surface, the store windows, polished counters, seemed to flicker with movement that wasn't mine. When I returned home, my door was closed, locked, and yet I could feel him, waiting inside, patient. One night, I had to check. I had to see what he was doing. I waited until the clock struck 2 when the house was silent and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. I crept down the hallway, flashlight in hand, every muscle tense. The beam of light shook slightly as I held it, illuminating the floorboards, the walls, the corners. Nothing. And then I saw it. A footprint, fresh this time, pressed into the thin layer of dust near the living room doorway. It was too perfect, too deliberate. I followed it slowly, careful not to breathe too loudly. It stopped at the base of the stairs, my second floor. I didn't want to go up. I wanted to run. But something, I can't explain what, made me climb anyway. Step by step, heart hammering, breath shallow. At the top, the hallway stretched before me, dark and empty. The footprints ended, and yet I knew he had been there. I could feel it, the residue of presence lingering in the air like smoke. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening. Every creak, every whisper of movement in the house sent my pulse racing. I imagined him pacing in the hallway, circling, waiting, patient and silent. I imagined him at the end of the hall, just out of reach, watching me. I imagined the darkness thickening, pressing against me, and realized I couldn't leave. Not really. Not yet. The man in the window had become more than a shadow. He was part of the house now, part of the walls, the floors, the corners where the light didn't reach. He was waiting for me to break, for me to slip, for me to see him clearly. And I was beginning to understand that no matter what I did, no matter where I ran, I couldn't escape him. I started noticing other things, subtle at first. A whisper, like air brushing against a microphone, just at the edge of hearing, a shadow that didn't align with the shape of the furniture. My own reflection in the hallway mirror sometimes seemed delayed, like it was hesitating, just behind me, even when I moved. I began avoiding mirrors, avoiding any reflective surface that might betray the truth. I stopped trying to rationalize. There was no reasoning with this, no logical explanation. The footprints, the moved objects, the shifting shadows, they were real. And he was real. Whatever he was. I don't know what I expected when I moved here. A quiet house, maybe. A fresh start. Instead, I inherited something older, something patient and deliberate. Something that waits in the corners, in the cracks of the floorboards, in the dark spaces where my eyes cannot reach. The man in the window has begun to teach me fear in a way I've never known. Not the fear of pain, not the fear of danger, but the fear of being watched, of knowing, beyond doubt, that someone is there, moving silently, existing just out of sight, waiting for the moment I relax, waiting for the moment I breathe too freely, waiting to make himself known. And I am running out of time because the footprints are closer to my bedroom each night, and one day I fear he will stop waiting. I finally called the police. I didn't want to. Every fiber of me screamed that it would be useless, but I had to try. I had to tell someone. Someone had to believe me. The dispatcher sounded polite, professional, but distant. She asked my name, my address, and then, after a brief pause, said they would send someone to check things out. When the detective arrived, I felt a flicker of hope. He was middle-aged, with tired eyes and a slow, deliberate way of moving. I led him through the house, pointing to the window where I had seen the man, to the hallway where the footprints never made sense, to the spots where items had shifted inexplicably. He listened politely, nodding occasionally, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He didn't ask questions about the windows, about shadows, about whispers in the hallway. Instead, he asked me how I was sleeping, if I'd been under stress, if anything in my personal life had changed. "I see," he said finally, standing at the end of the hallway, arms crossed. "These occurrences, how long have you noticed them?" I told him. "Weeks." I described the footprints, the moved objects, the feeling of being watched. My voice shook, but I tried to keep it steady, to make him understand. He nodded again, slowly, as though considering a patient child's story. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "our minds can play tricks on us, especially after moving into a new place. Stress can make us see things, hear things, even notice patterns that aren't there. It's common." I wanted to shout. I wanted to scream at him that I knew what I saw, that I wasn't imagining it. But the words caught in my throat, because part of me began to doubt. "Are you suggesting I'm imagining this?" I asked, voice trembling. He didn't answer directly. He tilted his head, studying me as if weighing my sanity against the facts. "I'm saying that sometimes people under stress interpret ordinary things in alarming ways. Footprints, shadows, moved objects. It could be a combination of environmental factors and the mind's response to fear. It's called psychological stress. Very normal." Normal. The word felt like a blade against my ribs. He didn't look at the dust patterns on the windowsill, or the footprints that had appeared overnight, or the cold weight pressing against me when I walked through the hall. He didn't look at me the way someone who had actually seen something terrifying would. I know what I saw," I said. My hands were trembling so badly I had to grip the edge of the counter. "Someone, something, has been in my house. I see it. I feel it. I can't sleep. It's real." He sighed softly, almost pityingly. "I'm not saying you're lying. I'm saying the mind is very powerful, and fear can be very convincing. I've seen it before." I wanted to argue. I wanted to prove him wrong. But how could I? There was no evidence. No one else had seen him. No one else had heard the whispers, felt the gaze, traced the footprints. And somehow his calm, measured dismissal made me feel smaller, weaker, as if my own mind were betraying me. Before leaving, he gave me a card. "If things escalate, if you feel unsafe, call again. Maybe even consider speaking with a professional about stress management. Sometimes it helps to have an outside perspective." I watched him go, the echo of his shoes fading down the walkway, leaving me alone with the house and its silent, patient shadows. I locked every door and window again, bolted everything, triple-checked the blinds, and still, I felt him. The man in the window, waiting, watching. That night, I tried to sleep. I wanted to believe the detective, to believe that my mind was playing tricks, that the fear was mine alone. But when I closed my eyes, I could see the hallway, the dark shape standing at the end. I could hear the soft shuffle of movement in the floorboards, and I could feel the gaze pressing down on me, patient and deliberate. I tried to turn on the light. My hand shook so badly the switch barely clicked. When it did, the hallway was empty. The footprints weren't there. Nothing had moved. The house was silent. And yet, I knew he was there. I began to notice other things, subtle but impossible to ignore. Objects I had set out in specific places were slightly off in the morning, just like before. The air sometimes smelled faintly metallic, almost like blood, though there was none. The shadows in the corners of rooms didn't match the furniture, the walls, the light. They twisted and shifted, moving independently, as if alive. Sometimes when I passed the mirrors in the hallway, I thought I saw movement behind me. A flicker. A shape. I would whip around and nothing would be there. My reflection looked normal, but it wasn't the same. Something was there with me, just out of reach. I began to feel disconnected from reality. Friends' voices sounded distant, distorted, as though I were hearing them through water. Their concern felt fake, their advice hollow. I couldn't tell them the truth, not really. How could I? How could I explain what waits in shadows, in the corners of my vision, in the spaces where light refuses to linger? The police hadn't helped. The detective's words echoed in my mind. Psychological stress. They were meant to comfort, I think, but they didn't. They made me feel weaker, more alone. They made me wonder if maybe I was losing control, if maybe the fear was my own mind, shaping the world into something unrecognizable. And yet, every night, I saw him. Not clearly, never fully, but always enough. Enough to know he was real. Enough to feel him, waiting, patient, watching. I tried to leave again. I went to a coffee shop, a bookstore, anywhere I could escape the house. But it didn't matter. I could feel him there. Not in the store, not in the street, but with me, pressing against my mind, brushing against the edges of my thoughts. I thought I could outrun it, but there is no running from presence. There is no hiding from eyes that do not blink. Sometimes I whisper his name aloud to see if it will make him stop. It doesn't. He doesn't respond. He doesn't need to. He doesn't move because he doesn't have to. The fear is enough. The waiting is enough. Sleep is impossible. Food is tasteless. Water feels warm and metallic in my mouth. Every reflective surface, every dark corner, every hallway stretching from my bedroom to the living room feels alive with him. I feel his steps, his presence, even when I'm certain no one is there. And every night I find myself staring at the window, even though I know he's gone. I know the glass is empty. I know the street outside is silent. But I can't stop, because he will come back. He always comes back. The detective didn't help. The world outside doesn't help. No one sees him but me, and that makes the world unsafe. The house itself has become a trap, and I am the only one caught in it. I think about moving again. Packing up everything, leaving the house forever. But the thought terrifies me. He doesn't just live in the house. He lives in the space between fear and reason, in the gaps where the mind can't reach. He waits there, always, patient, watching, and I don't know how long I can last. I don't know how long I can pretend to sleep while knowing he is out there, circling, always patient, always waiting. The police dismissed me. Friends ignore the truth in my voice, and I am left with him. The man in the window. The shadow in the hall. The presence that waits for me, always just out of reach, always patient. I don't know what he is. I don't know why he watches. I only know that I can't stop noticing. That I can't stop feeling him. That every time I close my eyes, every time I move through the hall, he is there, just beyond vision, and the dread never leaves. And sometimes, I whisper to myself, maybe he isn't real. But deep down, I know he is. I thought I had seen everything. Footprints, moved objects, whispers in the hallway, shadows that didn't belong. I thought there was a limit to what fear could teach me. I was wrong. It started with the mirror in the bathroom. A simple, unremarkable mirror framed in plain wood. I had never paid much attention to it, just a functional object. But that night I noticed something. A flicker. A movement behind me in the glass. I turned quickly. Nothing. Just the pale yellow tiles, the white sink, the toothbrush I had left on the counter. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining it. My brain was exhausted, frayed by weeks of sleepless nights and constant tension. I didn't want to believe it, but the mirror, something about it, felt wrong. I stared at my reflection, willing myself to see nothing. And then I saw him, not in the room, not behind me, but in the glass, a shadow. A tall, thin figure standing in the doorway behind me. I froze, heart hammering. My own reflection blinked. The shadow didn't. Its eyes were dark, unreadable, fixed on me. I spun around. Nothing. The hallway was empty. My bedroom door was closed, every window locked. But when I looked back at the mirror, he was there again, waiting, watching, patient. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the rug. My hands shook as I wiped the glass with a cloth, trying to erase the image, to convince myself it was a trick of light, a reflection of the street lamp outside. But even after wiping, even after scrubbing, the shimmer of him lingered. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. Enough to know he had been there. Or had never left. After that night, I stopped looking in mirrors. I avoided them in the hallway, in the bathroom, even the shiny surface of the kitchen table. But the reflections came to me anyway. Sometimes in the window I thought I saw him standing behind me, impossibly still. Sometimes the faint reflection of a figure would appear in the television screen when it was off, or in the silvered surface of the toaster, or in the dark water of my coffee cup. I began to dread every reflective surface. My house, which had always been quiet and hollow, started to feel alive. Not in a normal way, not in a creaking floorboards, whined in the rafters way. Alive in a way that watched me, that waited for me to see it, that thrived on my fear. One night I woke to the sound of my own footsteps, soft, echoing in the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze. I hadn't moved. I lay still, heart hammering, listening. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a creak, like a chair shifting, though I had no chairs in that part of the hall. I forced myself out of bed, shaking, flashlight in hand. Every instinct screamed to stay in the bedroom, to hide, to pretend I was asleep. But something made me go. Step by step, I crept down the hallway. The light illuminated the floorboards, the walls, the corners where shadows pooled. Nothing, and then I saw it. In the large mirror at the end of the hall, he wasn't behind me. He was in the glass, leaning slightly forward. His face was featureless, or maybe I just couldn't see it. His eyes were dark, deep hollows. The longer I looked, the more I felt it. Not fear exactly, not yet, but the wrongness of it, the way the air itself seemed to bend around him. I blinked. He was gone, but I could still feel him. His presence lingered in the hall, heavier than air, pressing against me. I tried to move forward, to touch the mirror, to see if it was, I don't know, some trick. My hand hovered over the glass. The reflection remained blank. Nothing. Just my own pale face staring back at me, trembling, eyes wide. I backed away, stumbling. My flashlight shook in my hand. Every instinct told me to run, but I didn't. I couldn't. Part of me needed to see, needed to know. Then the impossible happened. Another mirror, in the kitchen. I had avoided it for days, but I passed by unaware. I glanced down, and there he was. Standing behind me, though my back was to a wall. His form darkened the reflection, tall and still, patient. I spun around. Nothing. The kitchen was empty. The windows were locked. The night outside was silent. I began to understand something terrifying. He wasn't just outside waiting at the window. He was here, in the house, in the reflections, in the spaces where mirrors should have been blank. He didn't need to move. He didn't need doors or windows. He was everywhere, or maybe nowhere, and that was worse. Sleep became impossible. I started sleeping with my back against the wall, my eyes scanning the room for reflective surfaces. Every shiny object, every glint of metal, every glassy surface became a threat. I couldn't eat without checking my coffee cup, my knife, my toaster. I couldn't brush my teeth without glancing in the bathroom mirror to make sure he wasn't there. I tried covering mirrors with cloth, plastic, anything I could find. It didn't matter. Sometimes, when I pulled the covers away for light, I would catch a glimpse, just a flicker, of him behind me, in a reflection that shouldn't exist. I stopped leaving my room at night. I barricaded myself inside, piling furniture against the door, covering windows. But even then, I could feel him. I could feel the pressure of his presence in the corners of the room, in the air, in the edges of my vision. One night, I woke to the sound of whispering. Low, soft, curling around the walls like smoke. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't random. It was deliberate. And when I forced myself to look at the dresser mirror across the room, I saw him. Not fully, not clearly. Just a shadow, a movement, a dark shape. But it was enough. He leaned forward slightly, as if trying to see me through the glass, patient, waiting. My chest tightened. My lungs refused to work properly. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was frozen, trapped by fear, trapped by the knowledge that he was everywhere and nowhere, and I couldn't escape him. Days and nights lost all meaning. Time became irrelevant. Mirrors, windows, shiny surfaces. Everywhere I looked, I felt him. Watching, waiting, patient. The detective's words from before haunted me. Psychological stress. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to prove him wrong. But even as I thought it, I knew. I didn't need mirrors to see him. I could feel him in the dark. I could feel him behind me, above me, pressing down, curling into the shadows. I began talking to myself, whispering into the empty rooms, hoping it would chase him away. It didn't. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of him in the corner of my eye, just behind the reflection of my own face. He moved differently in the glass, bending in impossible ways, tilting, leaning forward when I leaned back. I couldn't tell if it was real or not, but I knew it was. The house had become a labyrinth of reflections, a maze where every surface betrayed me. I avoided mirrors entirely, avoided the windows, the kitchen counters, the shiny surfaces that had once been mundane. I lived in shadow, moving carefully, never turning my back, never letting my eyes relax. And every night, I saw him again. Not through the window this time, not outside. In the glass, in the silvered surfaces, in every reflection where he shouldn't exist. Patient, waiting, watching. I don't know how long I can last. The fear has become constant, a living thing pressing against me, curling into the corners of my vision, shaping my thoughts, twisting my reality. I don't know how long I can survive the reflection, the shadow, the presence that doesn't need to exist to terrify me. And sometimes I catch a glimpse of him in my own eyes, staring back at me through the reflection of my face, patient, unblinking, knowing that I know he is there, and that I can never truly escape him. I woke to a cold draft, the kind that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. My room felt wrong immediately, like the air itself was different, heavier. My heart slammed in my chest before I opened my eyes fully, and that's when I saw it. The window, wide open, I froze, hands gripping the sheets. The latch had been secure when I went to bed. I knew it had been locked, and yet there it was, swung wide, the night air pouring in, carrying the faint smell of wet asphalt and leaves. My curtains flapped gently in the wind, casting shadows across the walls, shadows that didn't belong. The bed sagged as I swung my legs over the side. My bare feet touched the floor, cold and trembling. I felt him immediately. Not a shadow, not a reflection this time. The presence itself. The house felt hollow, open, as if it had been waiting for something. And I knew he wasn't at the window anymore. He had gone. Relief should have flooded me. It didn't. The emptiness left behind was worse, heavier. The weight of him had lifted, but it wasn't gone. I could feel it lingering in the corners, coiling around the walls, twisting in the darkness beyond the hallway. I stood slowly, every nerve screaming, and stepped toward the window. Outside, the street was empty. No sign of him. No footprints in the gravel, no figure waiting across the way. Just silence. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was over, that the terror had left with the night air. And then I saw it. Scratches. On the walls. They started low, at the base of the window, claw marks pressed deep into the paint. My stomach dropped as I traced them with my fingers, feeling the grooves like they were etched into my skin. And then I noticed them stretching upward, longer and sharper, like someone or something had climbed, leaving nails behind. And then I saw the words, my name, each letter jagged, raw, impossible, like it had been carved with fingernails into the walls themselves. I stumbled back, heart racing, mouth dry, unable to breathe. I tried to speak, but no sound came. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I just stared, trembling, at the name spelled out in deep scratches across the white paint. My own name. The wind from the open window tugged at the curtains, and I swore I could feel him brushing past me, just beyond reach. Patient, silent, waiting, watching. I ran my hands over the scratches again. They were real. I could feel the ridges, the sharp edges. Nothing in my mind could have created this. Nothing in the world could explain it. And yet I didn't see him. He had vanished. I backed away from the window, eyes scanning the room, every dark corner, every shadow. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. The house was silent. But I knew. I knew he was gone, yes, but he wasn't gone. Not really. The marks on the wall were proof enough. He had been here. Close enough to leave his signature behind. Close enough to make me feel the cold press of his body, the patient weight of his gaze. I wanted to call the police. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run and never look back. But my phone lay on the nightstand, charging. I picked it up with trembling hands, staring at the black screen, imagining him waiting for me to move, waiting for me to breathe too freely. Outside, the night was still. The streetlights flickered gently, casting uneven light into my room. And yet, I could feel it. An empty space filled with eyes, a void that shouldn't exist. He had gone, yes, but he had left part of himself behind. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window shivering, tracing the scratches with my fingers, willing myself not to look beyond the walls. Every gust of wind, every creak in the floorboards, every shadow sliding across the curtains made my skin crawl. In the morning, I saw them again. The scratches had multiplied. They spread along the walls, extending down the hallway across the door frames. The letters of my name were repeated, carved over and over as though he wanted me to remember, to understand that he had been inside, had touched the house, had been here. I tried to clean them, to scrub them away, but it was useless. Paint peeled in chunks, and beneath it, more scratches appeared, deeper, sharper. The house itself had become a message board for him, a canvas for his patience, his obsession. I left the house briefly that day. I needed to escape, to breathe air that didn't feel saturated with him. But when I returned, I realized something terrifying. The marks hadn't changed when I was gone. They hadn't multiplied in my absence. But the sense of being watched, of being followed, of being known, it had grown. I began checking every mirror, every reflective surface, every shiny object in the house. Nothing. No reflection this time. He wasn't in the glass. He wasn't in the shadows. He had vanished, and yet I could feel him. I could feel him everywhere, in the air, pressing into my chest, curling around the edges of the walls, shaping my reality, shaping my fear. That night I lay in bed, facing the wall covered in scratches. My body was tense, every muscle taut, every nerve screaming. I listened. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every groan of the floorboards sounded like him. And I knew he would return. The wind shifted, brushing against the curtains. I held my breath, heart pounding so loudly I feared it would be heard outside. The window was closed now, latched, locked, but I could feel the space behind it. He had gone, yes, but he had left his mark, and marks don't lie. I thought about leaving again, packing everything, abandoning the house forever. But the scratches, my name repeated over and over, clawed into the walls. I couldn't leave, because leaving would mean admitting that he had power, that he had followed me into my life, into my home, and that there was no escaping him. I don't know how long it has been since that night. Days? Weeks? Time has blurred, meaningless now. Every night I lie awake, tracing the scratches with my eyes, listening to the wind, imagining the shape of him in the corners, imagining the patient, unblinking gaze of the man in the window. And sometimes I swear I hear scratching again. Not the wind, not the house settling, but nails, long, deliberate scratches. Across the floorboards, across the walls, as if he is still here, waiting, watching, patient. The window remains closed now, the curtains drawn tight, the house silent. But I know it's not over. He doesn't need to be seen to exist. He doesn't need a body to terrify me. He only needs patience, and he has plenty of that. I don't know if he will ever return fully, or if the scratches will keep appearing on their own, spelling my name in the dark, in the corners, in the spaces where shadows pool. I only know that I can feel him, that I can feel the gaze behind the glass, the presence in the walls, the patient, unblinking weight of something that shouldn't exist. The man in the window is gone, but he isn't. And I don't think he ever will be. I never thought I'd end up here, sitting alone in my little security booth, surrounded by trees that stretch taller than anything I've ever seen. I watch the shadows twist and stretch under the cold glare of the floodlights. The park isn't open at night, not really. People come here during the day, smiling and laughing, but at night it becomes something else, something that hums just beyond the edge of what you can see. I started this job thinking it would be simple. Walk the trails, check the gates, make sure no one wandered in after hours. The pay isn't bad, and I've always liked the solitude. But there's nothing simple about this place after dark. There's a weight in the air, thick and wet, like the forest itself is pressing down on me, listening. I can feel it even when the lights are on, buzzing behind my eyes, whispering through the branches. The first week, I thought I was imagining things. A twig snapping where it shouldn't, a shadow moving faster than it could be. But then I started noticing patterns, footprints, human footprints, some old, some fresh, pressed into the dirt and leaves. They don't make sense. They start on the trail and vanish into the woods like someone, or something, doesn't want to be found. The old ranger before me said hikers have gone missing here for decades. Decades. I never believed it until I saw the signs. I remember my first night walk. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, but underneath there was something sour, almost metallic. I turned a corner near the old picnic area, and there it was. A shoe, worn and cracked, half buried in the soil. No person around, no tracks leading to it, just that one shoe, lying like it had been dropped in a hurry, or maybe thrown. I wanted to call it in, but the radio in my hand felt heavy, useless. By midnight, the forest changes. Even with the floodlights, the shadows creep closer, folding over the paths, reaching under the trees. The wind isn't just wind. It carries whispers, tiny, fleeting, impossible to catch. Sometimes I think I hear my name, or maybe it's the echo of someone who used to be here. I quicken my pace, telling myself it's just nerves. But the forest is patient. It waits, watches, and it knows you're alone. There's a part of the park where the trees grow so close together. The moonlight can't reach the ground. I call it the hollow. Nobody walks there, not even during the day. I tried once, just to see, and I felt like the trees themselves were shifting, like they were watching me, pressing inward. My skin crawled, my stomach twisted, and I had to turn back. The footprints there are older, deeper, as if the earth itself remembers every person who vanished here. I've talked to some of the older rangers. They say there's always been something in the forest, something that doesn't belong to the world we live in. They don't say much, just give a tight smile and a shrug like that explains everything. But I've felt it. Sometimes, when I'm patrolling alone, I swear I can see shapes moving between the trees, just beyond the edge of the lights. Not animals, not people, something else. And it's always watching. The nights blend together after a while. You start seeing the same things in different places. A shadow under a tree, a flash of movement, a broken branch where none should be. My flashlight becomes a shield and a curse. Every time I shine it into the darkness, it's like I wake something up. The forest reacts. Leaves rustle even when there's no wind. Branches snap in places too far to reach. I've thought about quitting, but something keeps me here. I don't know what it is. Fear, maybe. Or curiosity. Or the need to see just once what's out there. I try to keep busy. Check the gates. Walk the trails. Log everything. But the forest has a rhythm of its own. My footsteps echo differently here. Animals don't behave like they should. Deer vanish at the edge of the light. Birds stop singing. Even the wind seems hesitant, holding its breath. And then there are the sounds I can't explain. A distant thump like a footstep. A rustle that moves faster than anything living. Sometimes I hear laughter. Not human laughter, something higher, lighter, brittle. It vanishes before I can focus on it, leaving my heart hammering. I've started seeing things in the booth, too. Shapes at the windows moving when I turn my back. Shadows that stretch too long, bend in ways they shouldn't. One night, I thought I saw someone standing outside, just beyond the fence. I raised my flashlight, called out, but no one was there. Only the trees swaying, patient and silent. I know my mind plays tricks. I tell myself that every night. But it doesn't explain the footprints, the lost items, the smell of something rotten that comes and goes with no source. Some nights, I talk to the trees, laugh at myself, try to reason with whatever it is watching me. I'm just doing my job, I whisper, hoping that saying it aloud keeps me safe. Sometimes it works. Other times I feel its attention sharpen like a predator focusing, patient and deliberate. I can feel the gaze crawl over my skin, tracing my movements. And I know, if I misstep, if I look in the wrong direction, it could take me just like it took the others. I've seen the old campsite once. Rusted cans, a torn tent, a fire pit with charred wood. Nobody's been there for years. But the forest doesn't forget. Footprints lead to it, circle it, and vanish. I don't know where they go or if anyone's even there. Just looking at the place makes my chest tighten. It's a reminder that this forest keeps its secrets, and sometimes it shares them in ways you can't understand. I started keeping a journal, writing down what I see. Maybe someone will find it one day. Maybe it will explain why I couldn't leave. Or maybe it will just be another lost record like the ones that came before me. The trees outside my booth press against the glass, shadows pooling at the corners. I can feel the forest breathing, slow and deep, a rhythm older than anything I know. And I know I will never truly be alone here. Not really. Every night I tell myself it's just another shift, another few hours until sunrise, when the park becomes safe again. But deep down, I know that safety is an illusion. The forest doesn't care about hours or days. It exists outside of them, patient, hungry, and waiting for someone to slip, to follow a trail too far, to become another echo in its dark. And I wonder, am I already too far in? Or am I still just on the edge, peering in, hoping I can see the truth before it sees me? Sometimes I think about leaving. Every rational part of me screams to pack up, quit, go back to the life I left behind. But the forest has a pull, a gravity that's impossible to fight. And every time I step onto a trail, flashlight in hand, I feel it watching, following, learning. I tell myself I'm brave. I tell myself it's only fear. But the truth is, this forest doesn't just watch, it waits. And it remembers. The night stretches on. The wind shifts. The shadows twist. And somewhere in the distance I hear it again. The faintest sound of someone or something moving through the trees. I freeze, heart thundering, listening. No footsteps. No breathing. Just a faint, lingering presence, patient, deliberate. I know I'm not alone. I never have been. Not really. And as the night drags on, I understand something I can't put into words. The forest is alive, and it's waiting for me to make the next mistake. The forest was quieter that night, but quieter in the wrong way. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, fills your chest, and makes every heartbeat thunder like a drum. I thought I knew the trails by now, thought I could anticipate the shadows, the shapes, the whistling, but I was wrong. The forest doesn't care about familiarity. It doesn't care about survival. It only cares about presence. I had been walking for hours, flashlight cutting ragged lines through the trees. The hollows seemed endless, each turn twisting into another identical stretch of darkness, another wall of trees that pressed too close. The ground was soft under my boots, littered with leaves, old branches, and the occasional footprint. Human, I think, though sometimes I wonder if the forest itself leaves them, mocking me. My nerves were raw. Every rustle, every snap, every shadow made me flinch. And the whistling, it was quiet tonight, almost respectful. But I could feel it, patient, circling, waiting. Then I saw it, a clearing. At first it seemed like a relief, a break in the suffocating maze of trunks. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't safe. The air smelled different here, older, like earth turned over decades ago. And in the center, remnants of a campsite, a fire pit, blackened and cold, rusted cans scattered across the soil, a torn tent, half collapsed, overgrown with vines. I froze, flashlight trembling in my hands. This place, it wasn't just old. It was abandoned, forgotten, and yet the footprints leading into it were fresh, pressed into the dirt as if someone had arrived just hours ago. I knelt to examine them. They didn't lead out. They stopped. Just vanished. I stood, stomach twisting, eyes scanning the tree line. The forest was impossibly still. No birds, no wind. Even the insects had gone mute. It was as if the clearing itself was holding its breath. And then I noticed the shapes at the edges, shadows that shouldn't move, bending around the trunks, forming angles that made my mind ache. I stepped back. My foot caught a root and I stumbled. The flashlight swung wildly, catching a glimpse of something in the corner of my vision. A figure, or maybe just a trick of the light, slipped between two trees. I froze, heart hammering. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, a leftover fear from the whistling. But the forest was too patient, too deliberate. Whatever was here was aware of me, watching, waiting. I followed the footprints again, stepping carefully through the leaves. They led away from the campsite, deeper into the trees. I thought I could trace them, maybe find the person or thing that made them. But the forest had other plans. The trail twisted impossibly. One moment I was sure I was moving forward. The next, the trees seemed to have shifted. I was lost. Every familiar landmark dissolved into a sea of trunks and shadows. The clearing felt miles away behind me, though I had just left it. Panic clawed at my throat. My flashlight flickered. I shook it, muttering curses, but it didn't stay steady for long. The forest seemed alive, aware, twisting around me, rearranging itself. I stumbled into a fallen tree, brushing against moss slick with moisture. That's when I heard it, the faintest scrape of something moving just ahead, between the trunks. I called out. My voice sounded wrong, swallowed by the trees. Silence answered. And then, footprints, not the old ones, fresh. Just a few steps ahead, pressed into the damp soil. They didn't lead anywhere. They ended in midair, or at least it seemed that way. My mind screamed to turn back, but something compelled me forward, curiosity threading into fear, pulling me along. I reached the center of another small clearing and my breath caught. There was a tent, smaller, ancient, a fire pit long gone cold, and around it, objects left behind, a rusted canteen, a charred cooking pot, fragments of clothing too old to name. The forest smelled of decay, of earth turned over and left to rot. And in the soft dirt around the tent, more footprints, human old but recent. They twisted in impossible patterns, spiraling toward nowhere, leaving me dizzy, nauseous. I realized then that the forest doesn't forget. It keeps everything, everyone, trapped in the soil, in the roots, in the shadows. Hikers lost decades ago, maybe even longer. They were here. Pieces of them scattered, feeding the forest in ways I couldn't understand. And now, I was part of it too. My boots pressed into the soft dirt, leaving new prints. Prints that would eventually vanish. A rustle behind me. I spun, flashlight swinging. Shadows moved between the trees, bending, twisting. No shape fully formed, no face, no figure I could recognize. Just presence. Patient, deliberate. I could feel it pressing closer, cold fingers brushing my skin, though no one touched me. My mouth went dry. I tried to speak, tried to call out, but words refused to form. The clearing seemed to pulse, breathing with the trees. Every step I took echoed like a drumbeat, though there was no one to hear it. And then, the footprints. They moved. Not mine, not human, but they shifted in the dirt, tracing patterns that shouldn't exist. Circles, spirals, angles. My mind refused to compute, and I understood something terrifying. The forest itself was alive. It wasn't just watching. It was interacting, shaping reality around me, testing me. I ran, stumbling over roots, tripping on moss-covered rocks, desperate to escape. The shadows, stretched, bent, Sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, always present. I could feel the air thickening, curling around my throat, clawing at my chest. The forest was aware, intelligent, patient, and it didn't like being disturbed. I stumbled into a narrow path, almost hidden by thick undergrowth. The footprints led here too, then disappeared. I could see the edge of the clearing behind me, glowing faintly in the moonlight. But no matter how I turned, no matter how I moved, I couldn't find a way out. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow moved just slightly, as if breathing. Panic twisted into something sharper. Realization. I was trapped. Not by the trees, not by the darkness, but by the awareness itself. And then I heard it. Not whistling this time. A whisper. Soft, dry, almost like leaves brushing together. You shouldn't be here. My name? Maybe. Maybe not. It didn't matter. It was enough. Enough to freeze me where I stood, knife clutched uselessly in my hand. The forest leaned closer, listening, waiting. I could feel the ground shift beneath me, as if the earth itself was aware of my presence, my fear, my breath. I pressed my back to a tree, flashlight shaking in my hand. Shadows pressed closer, folding around me, bending into angles that made no sense. I tried to run again, but the path twisted, the trees rearranged. I couldn't move forward, couldn't go back. My own prints, my own body, betrayed me. The forest had me. Not physically, not yet, but mentally, spiritually. Every instinct screamed to leave. Every rational thought failed, and then I saw them. Remnants of the old campsite moving, not physically moving, but shifting in the corner of my eye. Old cans glinting, torn cloth swaying, roots lifting slightly as if breathing. The forest wasn't just alive, it remembered. It held the echoes of everyone who had ever entered, everyone who had disappeared, everything. And it was showing me what became of those who stayed too long. I fell to my knees, hands pressed into the dirt, heart hammering. I could hear my own name whispered among the leaves. I could see the patterns in the soil, the spirals, the circles, the endless loops of footprints. I wanted to scream, to run, to disappear, but I knew the forest would find me, no matter what. It had always found them, and now it would find me. I closed my eyes, hoping for nothing, hoping the night would end, the forest would relent, the darkness would stop, but the forest never relents. It waits. It remembers. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of vision, I could feel the shapes leaning closer, the shadows bending, the echoes of the lost circling. I understood finally. The forest doesn't let go. It doesn't care who you are. It only cares that you're here, that you are aware, that you are alive. And in this awareness, it consumes, folds, remembers. I was just another set of footprints in the soil, another whisper in the trees, another echo among the forest's endless dark. The clearing seemed infinite now, each tree a sentinel, each shadow a memory. I was lost. I was trapped. Not by walls, not by branches, not by anything I could see, but by the forest itself. Alive, aware, unrelenting. And I understood, with a clarity that burned through every nerve, I would never leave. Not really. Not ever. The forest waited, and I waited with it. I've been retired for a while now, but some cases never leave you. Some refuse to die quietly in a filing cabinet. I keep telling myself it's just old habits, that the mind clings to what it can't solve. But I know the truth. Some shadows follow you, even after you've hung up your badge. My last case. It's still here, lingering, cold, silent, like a room no one dares enter. I sit at my desk, the lamp casting a weak yellow glow over stacks of folders. Dust motes float in the light, and for a moment, I think I can see them dancing like tiny ghosts. The air smells faintly of old paper and coffee. I've tried to throw these files away more times than I can count, but every time I reach for the shredder, something stops me. Fear, maybe. Or respect. Or perhaps a nagging sense that the story isn't finished. That someone, something, hasn't finished with me. It started years ago. Disappearances that made no sense. Adults, teens, even children, vanishing from their homes or streets with no trace. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no ransom notes, nothing but silence and an empty space where a life used to be. The first few were chalked up to runaways, bad choices, accidents, but then the pattern grew, one after another, strangers disappearing in ways that felt deliberate, methodical, like someone was playing a game with me and I wasn't invited. I run my hands over the photographs again, faces frozen in time. I can almost hear their voices, though I know it's only the memory of my own imagination. A little boy with freckled cheeks and wide, curious eyes. A young woman smiling at the camera, unaware that she wouldn't return home that night. I look at each photo as if the answer is hiding behind the glass, as if they're whispering to me through the frozen smiles. But they don't speak. Not really. The first report I got, I remember clearly. A girl named Lisa Harper, 17, vanished from her apartment in the middle of the night. No signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, nothing out of place. I went door to door, talked to neighbors, checked surveillance footage, even went through her social media. Everything was clean, too clean. It didn't feel like a typical disappearance. It felt deliberate, calculated. And I remember the sinking feeling in my stomach when I realized there were no clues. Nothing. Then it happened again and again. And soon I noticed something. A rhythm, a sequence, dates, locations, ages. At first I thought I was imagining it. Our minds are terrible at seeing patterns where none exist. But then I drew maps, made charts, connected dots, and the truth became undeniable. Someone was orchestrating this, someone who wanted to be invisible and meticulous, and I couldn't stop them. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. Retirement was supposed to be peace, quiet mornings with coffee, maybe a book or a walk through the park. Instead, I sit here night after night, with the ghosts of people I couldn't save staring at me from their faded photographs. They haunt me in ways no living person ever could. They linger in corners of my mind, whispering that I missed something, that I failed. Sometimes when the house is quiet, I think I hear the faint sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer, then fading. I know it's my imagination. I've convinced myself of that 100 times. But the thought never quite goes away. And then I look at the folders stacked neatly, or not so neatly, on the edge of my desk, and I wonder if maybe it's not imagination at all. Maybe it's a warning, or maybe it's just the echo of the cases themselves, restless because they haven't been solved. I take out a notebook, yellowed pages, corners bent from years of use. I've started writing again, even though I swore I wouldn't. Listing details, names, times, addresses, descriptions, every tiny fragment I can remember. Even the smallest observations, odd smells reported by neighbors, fleeting shadows, noises that seemed to vanish as soon as someone noticed. At the time, they didn't mean much. Now they loom over me like warnings etched in smoke. Sometimes I wonder if I should just let it go. Burn the files, throw away the photos, lock the door, and never look back. But every instinct in me resists. It's not pride, not exactly. It's fear. Fear that the pattern is still out there, continuing, waiting, just beyond the light of my desk lamp. And maybe, deep down, a part of me hopes that if I stare long enough, if I connect enough dots, I might stop it. Or at least understand it. The neighbors rarely speak to me anymore. Not that I want them to. When the disappearances first started, everyone was curious, concerned. They whispered about theories, suspects, conspiracies, but time dulls interest. The world moves on, and only the detective remembers. Only I keep count. I keep tally of every child, every woman, every man who vanished, every last one of them that I couldn't save. And sometimes I think that's what haunts me the most. Not the faces, not the fear, not the unknown. It's the knowledge that they were real people, people who existed. And now, in the quiet corners of the world, they are gone, and no one will ever notice. I glance at the clock. Hours have passed, coffee gone cold. Outside, the sky is dark, unbroken, endless, and I feel it again. The weight of the missing pressing against me, the invisible gaze that follows me from the edges of memory. I close my eyes for a moment, trying to shake the feeling, but it won't leave. There's a pattern here, a puzzle, and I'm the only one still trying to solve it. The drawer clicks as I open it, searching for something I haven't touched in years. A single folded photograph falls into my lap. It's from the first disappearance, the little girl, Lisa Harper. She's holding a small stuffed rabbit, looking up at the camera with that impossible innocence. And for a moment, I almost hear her voice. "Find me." It's not real, of course. Just memory playing cruel tricks. But my hands shake and my stomach tightens. Because deep down, I know the memory is right. Someone wants me to find them, or someone wants me to remember, or maybe someone has never stopped watching. I can't tell anyone. No one would understand. They'd call me paranoid, a retired man obsessed with old files. But I know better. There's something alive in these cases. Something patient. Something waiting for me to notice. And the thought of it being patient terrifies me more than anything else ever could. I look back down at the desk, at the folders, the photographs, the yellowed notebook, and I feel that old familiar ache, the ache of responsibility, of guilt, of helplessness. But I also feel the pull, the compulsion to continue, to dig deeper, to understand what I missed, even if it means confronting things I'm not ready to face. Because some shadows, once they find you, never let go. In some cases never die. I didn't expect to find her. Not really. The address had changed. The building aged, bricks crumbling, paint peeling. The world had moved on. But I hadn't. I pulled into the empty parking lot, heart thudding, as if it remembered the weight of the cases I carried. This was the last person alive who might remember anything. And even that was a question mark. Her name was Mrs. Caro. I first met her decades ago. An old lady living alone on the edge of the neighborhood, a witness to one of the earliest disappearances. Back then she was sharp, quick to notice details no one else would. She saw the unusual in the ordinary, and that made her dangerous, or useful. I hadn't thought of her for years, assuming she'd gone the way of most memories, fading, forgotten. But when I dug into the files last night, the memory of her voice, the trembling urgency, haunted me. So I came. The front door creaked when I knocked. No answer. I tried the knob, unlocked. I stepped inside, shoes soft on the worn carpet, and called her name. Nothing. The air smelled of dust and mothballs, the kind of smell that lingers when no one cleans, when the world outside has long been left at the door. I hesitated, half expecting her to appear around the corner, frail but sharp-eyed. Instead, the house was silent. Too silent. I found her in the kitchen, sitting at a table cluttered with papers and faded photographs. Her hair was whiter than I remembered, hands trembling, but her eyes were still alert, still sharp. She looked up at me, a flicker of recognition passing over her face before it was replaced with wariness. "Detective," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I didn't think anyone would come back." "I had to," I said. My throat was dry, words tasting like ash. "There are things I need to ask you, Mrs. Caro. Things you saw, things you remember." She sighed and motioned to the chair across from her. "I warned them then, and they didn't listen. And now, you want to know?" Her eyes flickered to the table, to the photographs. "Are you ready for what you might hear?" I nodded. I had to be ready. Or at least, I had to pretend I was. She began slowly, hesitantly, as if each word cost her. She remembered details no one should remember. Shadows moving against the walls when no one was there. Faces in the dark that disappeared if you blinked. Whispers, soft, almost apologetic, or maybe mocking. Strange symbols etched into tree trunks near the disappearance sites, half-carved, almost invisible. Patterns in the streets, in the timing of events, that didn't make sense to anyone else but screamed to her in nightmares. I listened, writing it all down, even though some of it sounded impossible. And yet there was a rhythm to her words, a certainty. She spoke of the missing as though she could feel them still, trapped somewhere just beyond reach. Sometimes, her voice faltered, quivering like a candle flickering in a draft. "They watched everything," she said once, staring at a mark on the table, as if the scratches themselves were a map. "They always watch." Her memory wasn't perfect. She stumbled over names, mixed dates, but the core of it, the strange, impossible details, remained. She could describe the angles of streetlights, the scent of something metallic in the air, the way a particular wind carried whispers across the neighborhood at night. Small things I hadn't noticed, small things I should have noticed. I felt it then, the same creeping dread that had haunted me for years. The feeling that someone, or something, was just beyond perception, watching us, waiting. Every so often, Mrs. Carroll would pause mid-sentence, her eyes darting to a shadowed corner, and I realized she could see it too, or she thought she could. I didn't interrupt. I let her see what she saw, because maybe that was part of the truth. She leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper. They like patterns, order, numbers, places, times. They leave traces, but only if you know how to look. Most people never notice. Most people never care. But you. Her eyes locked on mine, trembling, wild with something I didn't want to name. Fear, maybe, or desperation. You can see it. I swallowed hard. I wanted to tell her I didn't see it, that I wasn't special, that I wasn't marked for understanding these things. But I already knew I saw too much. I had always seen patterns no one else noticed. That's why I had chased these cases for so long, why they still clung to me even in retirement, because I could see the rhythm, the method, the madness. And it was patient. She reached across the table, gnarled hands shaking. I tried to warn them. I tried to warn everyone. But when they come, they don't leave mistakes. They never do. They choose carefully. They test. And they remember. I felt my stomach tighten. There it was again, that feeling of inevitability, that chill that I couldn't shake no matter how many years had passed. The cases weren't over. They couldn't be over. Someone, or something, was still out there, still orchestrating the vanishings. And Mrs. Carrow's recollections. They made it personal. They were warnings, messages, clues only I would understand. I asked about the first disappearance she remembered. She shivered but recounted it with eerie clarity. A teenage girl walking home, street empty, moon obscured by clouds. A flicker in the alleyway, just a movement too quick to catch. The girl paused, sensing something, but it was gone before anyone else could see it. Then nothing. Just silence. I had investigated that case exhaustively, followed every lead, but now, with her words, it felt different. Like I had been watching the wrong shadows all along, she went on, telling stories of other disappearances, each more surreal than the last. Details no one could possibly remember after decades. Shapes, numbers, locations repeating in patterns that chilled me. And in her trembling voice, I heard the same refrain. They're always careful, always watching, always one step ahead. I tried to hold my composure, to take it all down without faltering. But inside, a part of me was crumbling. This wasn't just memory. It was living history, a warning encoded in fear. And the fact that she still remembered, it meant the game wasn't over. Not by a long shot. At some point, she stopped speaking, staring at the wall as if it might answer her questions. I looked where she looked and saw nothing, just wallpaper peeling in the corners. And yet, the sense of being observed returned with a weight that pressed on my chest. I realized then that the witness wasn't just recalling events. She was reliving them with me. And whatever had haunted her all those years, it had never left. I thanked her, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. Promised to follow up, to investigate further, though I knew that meant nothing. She nodded, eyes distant. "Be careful," she said quietly. "They know who watches." I left her house with a growing knot of dread in my stomach. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet. Wind stirred the fallen leaves in patterns that seemed deliberate, and I had to remind myself I wasn't imagining them. Or maybe I was, but I didn't care, because the truth was worse than imagination. The truth was that patterns existed, and someone or something had been leaving them for decades, waiting for the right eyes to notice. I drove home slowly, haunted not just by what she said, but by what she didn't. The hesitations, the pauses, the way her eyes darted to unseen corners. I had spoken to witnesses before. I had interviewed neighbors. But this was different. This was someone who could still see the thing behind the disappearances. And the fact that she lived in fear all these years meant one thing. It had not stopped. It was patient. It was methodical. And it was still out there. Back at my desk, I spread the photographs and notes across the surface. I cross-referenced what she'd told me with my own files, my own maps, my own charts, and the connections emerged slowly, quietly, like shadows lengthening in the evening sun. Symbols repeated. Numbers aligned. Places echoed patterns I had only glimpsed before. It wasn't coincidence. It had never been coincidence. And as I stared at the pieces laid bare in front of me, a cold certainty sank in. The disappearances weren't random. They never had been. Someone had been planning this for years, maybe even decades. Someone who remembered every detail, every pattern, every witness, and now they knew I was paying attention. I closed the files, hands shaking. The feeling of being watched had returned, stronger, closer. It was impossible to ignore. Whatever was behind this, whatever had orchestrated all the vanishings, it hadn't gone away. And somehow I had a sinking sense that it was aware of me. I went to bed that night, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Shadows moved across the room in the dim light of street lamps outside, or maybe in my mind. I thought of Mrs. Carrow, frail yet unbroken, and realized she had been carrying this burden alone all these years. And now somehow it was mine again, because the witnesses remember. The patterns persist. And some things never stop. I've spent countless nights staring at these cases, letting the pieces of vanished lives pile around me like autumn leaves. But it wasn't until I went through Mrs. Carrow's notes alongside my own files that the patterns began to emerge. Not subtle, not random, but something deliberate, something meticulous. And the deeper I went, the more I realized I'd been looking at this all wrong. I hadn't been chasing a criminal. I'd been chasing a rhythm, a pulse, a code written in fear and absence. I laid the maps out across the dining table, photographs scattered on top. Each dot represented a disappearance. At first glance, chaos. Streets, neighborhoods, towns. But when I traced lines, drew circles, connected dates, a design began to form, something geometric, almost ritualistic. The edges of the city, old parks, abandoned buildings, alleyways where the lights were dim or flickered. It was like the disappearances followed a hidden architecture. The more I studied, the more I saw that every case fit into this invisible lattice. Every victim a node in some incomprehensible plan. I checked the dates. Numbers repeated. Some victims disappeared on the 3rd, some on the 14th, some on nights when the moon was new or barely a sliver in the sky. Others vanished at precise intervals. 7 days, 21 days, 35. I knew coincidence when I saw it, and this wasn't coincidence. This was deliberate. Someone had mapped time like a calendar of terror, a schedule that no one else could decipher. The symbols came next. I didn't recognize them at first. Marks etched into walls near where some victims had last been seen. Faint scratches on doors, almost invisible. Patterns in paint chips in broken fences. At first I thought it was graffiti. Then I realized the repetition. Circles, triangles, lines intersecting at odd angles. A language I didn't understand. And yet, staring at it long enough, a chill settled into my chest. I knew it wasn't just random scrawls. It was a signature. A statement. A map. I pulled out my notebook and copied every mark I could find from the files and Mrs. Carrow's sketches. Line by line, symbol by symbol, until they filled pages. And when I stepped back, I saw them forming something that didn't belong in the ordinary world. Patterns I could feel more than see, vibrating at the edge of perception. It was ritualistic, methodical, Every disappearance a piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to complete. I went over the locations again, reading addresses aloud in the empty room. The names, the streets, the parks, the alleys. They almost spoke in a rhythm, a cadence I didn't consciously recognize but felt in my chest. Lines of latitude, lines of longitude, the angles between certain buildings. Every vanishing point placed carefully, as though someone were sketching a design only they could understand. And I began to see why the cases had gone cold. There were no obvious leads, nothing concrete, just patterns, almost invisible, waiting for someone patient enough, and perhaps foolish enough, to notice. I sat back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. The city outside my window was quiet, ordinary, safe. Yet I knew better. I felt the pattern out there, woven into the streets, creeping through shadows and empty corners. It had been there all along, just under the surface, waiting for me to see. And now that I did, I couldn't unsee it. Numbers haunted me, not just dates but sequences, victims' ages, times of disappearance, the order in which they vanished, odd repetitions, ages adding up to the same totals, street numbers echoing in multiples of 3 or 5. The way the victims' last movements created triangles across the map. I had to write it all down, to make sense of it, to convince myself I wasn't imagining it. But the more I wrote, the more the room felt smaller, like the walls were pressing in, as if the building itself knew the patterns and disapproved of my scrutiny. The more I connected the dots, the more I realized the killings weren't random acts of violence. They were offerings, statements, rituals performed with precision and patience. The fear they caused was part of it. The disappearances, the uncertainty, the silence, they were ingredients in something larger, something I couldn't yet name. And the thought made my hands shake. I remembered Mrs. Caro's voice, her trembling warnings about watching and remembering. She hadn't understood the full scope, perhaps, but she had sensed the edges of it. The attention to detail, the care with which each victim was chosen, the invisible rules governing the sequence, it was all part of a code. And now, staring at my maps, I began to feel like I was being watched. Not physically, not yet. But the pattern itself seemed aware, responsive, as if someone knew I was piecing it together. I cross-referenced old newspaper reports, police files, neighborhood records. One anomaly after another revealed itself. Times when streetlights went out, footpaths that seemed ordinary but connected unusual locations, parks where the grass grew differently, worn in patterns that suggested movement, training, practice. I couldn't believe it. And yet everything fit. Everything aligned with the eerie sense of design I had felt for years but couldn't put into words. There were empty lots too, places where no one had vanished, yet the coordinates and alignments suggested they were part of the plan. They felt like placeholders, markers, points on a canvas. My chest tightened. If the killer, or the force behind this, was thinking decades ahead, plotting patterns I could barely trace, then what had been the purpose of the disappearances I had investigated, and what would come next? I noticed repetition in seemingly random details. Colors of clothing, small objects left behind, tiny scratches in furniture or doors. Each one minor on its own, meaningless. But together, as part of the pattern, they became coordinates, markers, even instructions. I started keeping a list, page after page of tiny mundane observations. And the more I compiled, the more I understood why no one had ever solved the cases. The world isn't built to notice subtle rituals. We miss the invisible. We are blind to it. By the time I went to bed, the patterns were in my head, spinning behind my eyelids, turning like a dark carousel. I dreamt of maps with lines that shifted as I moved, streets folding, numbers rearranging themselves into new sequences. Faces I had forgotten peeked out from the shadows, whispering in rhythms I didn't understand but felt in my chest. I woke sweating, heart racing, the faint smell of something metallic lingering in the air, though my apartment was empty. The next day, I returned to the files, compelled to follow the sequence further. I felt as if the act of noticing the pattern had drawn me deeper into it, made me a part of it. The thought made my stomach twist, a cold, sinking certainty I couldn't shake. Whatever orchestrated these disappearances, whoever or whatever it was patient, clever and aware. And now it had noticed me noticing. I found myself retracing routes, walking streets where victims had last been seen, trying to trace the lines, the angles, the coordinates, as if my legs could map the invisible. The wind through the alleys carried a whisper I couldn't place. Shapes lingered at the edges of vision. Nothing solid, nothing definable, yet unmistakable. I told myself it was exhaustion, obsession, imagination. But a part of me, the part that had chased shadows for decades, knew better. Patterns don't lie. They don't forget. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. I realized then that my obsession wasn't just about solving cold cases. It was about survival. Awareness was dangerous. Knowledge was dangerous. And somewhere out there, someone or something was orchestrating this, feeding the patterns, watching how I pieced it together. The thought wrapped around me like ice. If they had noticed me noticing, what was my role in the next act? I returned to the table, maps spread out, and stared at the web of vanishings, symbols, numbers, and places. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. I was aware of every tick of the clock, every flicker of light from the street outside. My hands hovered over the files, trembling because the patterns were alive. They weren't just historical records. They were a message. And I was the audience they had been waiting for. The truth settled into me like a weight I couldn't lift. This was never random. This was never over. And whoever had orchestrated it was still out there, patient, deliberate, meticulous. And now, somehow, they were aware that I had begun to see. And I realized, with a chill that spread to my bones, that seeing the pattern may have been the most dangerous thing of all. I thought I was done. I truly believed that once I had retired, once the files were stacked and dusted over, the disappearances had stopped. I told myself it was coincidence that the pattern had paused, that the city had finally swallowed its secrets. But I should have known better. The truth doesn't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't care if you're retired, tired, or trying to forget. It started with a phone call, a number I didn't recognize. A voice on the other end, young, trembling, almost whispering. "Detective, please, you have to come." I froze. Years of instinct and dread rose in my chest like a tide. My hands gripped the receiver until my knuckles whitened. The voice gave me an address. And when I checked the location, my stomach sank. It was the same pattern, the same rhythm, the same methodical placement. A disappearance that mirrored the cold cases exactly. I drove through the city at night, rain slicking the streets, the headlights casting reflections that looked like elongated shadows stretching toward me. Every street I passed felt wrong. Familiar streets seemed twisted, warped by memory and anticipation. And I knew before I even arrived that whatever had orchestrated the previous disappearances was alive again. It had never stopped. The apartment building was old, its bricks darkened by decades of rain and neglect. I parked a block away, heart hammering, and approached on foot. The front door was slightly ajar. I paused. My badge, long since retired, felt heavy in my pocket. Not a symbol of authority, but a reminder of what I had once failed to protect. Inside, the smell hit me first. Faint, metallic, almost like iron and old dust mixed together. It was the same scent I had noticed in some of the old cases, a smell I had dismissed at the time as coincidence. But it wasn't. Not now. It had a presence, a weight, an intention. I moved slowly through the apartment, senses straining. Shadows clung to corners, moving just at the edge of vision, always retreating when I tried to focus. The living room was empty, furniture untouched, personal belongings scattered as if someone had simply vanished. A backpack lay by the door, small, unzipped, contents untouched. I crouched to examine it. A notebook, a set of keys, a pen, ordinary things, normal things. But it all felt staged, deliberate. I checked the bedroom next. Same as before. Unmade bed. Personal items left behind. No struggle, no signs of forced entry. Only absence. Only emptiness. And in that emptiness, I felt the familiar pull of dread, the same pull that had haunted every unsolved case, every missing person I had failed to protect. I returned to the living room and noticed a pattern forming before my eyes. It was subtle, almost invisible, but unmistakable. The objects, the placement of furniture, even the stains on the carpet, they echoed the previous disappearances. Triangles, lines, alignments that mapped perfectly onto the old maps I had drawn. I staggered back, heart racing. I had seen this before. I had studied it for years, and now it was alive again, playing out in real time. I pulled out my notebook and jotted down every detail, trembling, aware that I was now inside the pattern itself. The lines, the angles, the repetitions, they were no longer historical. They were present, immediate, and I knew with a chill that crept into my bones that I had been expected. The phone rang. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The number was blocked. I answered, voice tight. "Detective," the voice whispered, familiar yet distorted. "You see it now, don't you?" I froze. Recognition flashed in my mind, a dark certainty I couldn't ignore. The patterns, the disappearances, the symbols, they weren't just crimes. They were messages, instructions, and I was being addressed directly. I see it," I said, my throat dry. "But why?" "Why now?" A pause, then, softly, "Because you've been watching." The line went dead. Silence pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. And I understood then what I had feared all along. Awareness was dangerous. Observation made me part of the game. By noticing the patterns, by tracing the invisible lines, I had drawn attention to myself. I left the apartment, walking the streets in a fog of dread. Every alleyway, every street corner, every flickering light seemed to hold a presence. I felt watched, followed, though I couldn't see who or what it was. My mind raced, connecting dots, recalculating, trying to predict the next move. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying than prediction. I had entered their rhythm. I was now part of the sequence. At home, I couldn't stop pacing. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in, the shadows stretching longer than they should, bending toward me. I reviewed my maps again, comparing them to this new disappearance. Everything aligned perfectly. I realized with a sickening certainty that the game was evolving, adapting, responding to me. Whoever orchestrated these vanishings was aware of my scrutiny, and that meant I was no longer an observer. I was a participant. Sleep was impossible. Every creak in the house, every flicker of light outside my window set my nerves on edge. I saw shapes in the corners of my vision, fleeting, impossible. A figure crossing the street where no one should be. A shadow that didn't match the movement of any person or object. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Fatigue, obsession, memory playing tricks. But my instincts screamed otherwise. Something was present, moving with intent, and it was waiting for me to notice. I called Mrs. Carroll the next morning, though I knew she would not answer. Her warnings echoed in my ears. They know who watches. I realized I had become the watcher she spoke of, and that meant I had become visible, vulnerable. I spent the day retracing steps, retracing the paths of the previous cases, following the angles, the coordinates, the lines that connected them. Everywhere I went, I felt the same presence, patient, silent, observing. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement, a figure at the edge of vision, but whenever I turned, nothing was there. It was a test, a warning, or perhaps just amusement. By nightfall, the realization hit me fully. The disappearances had never stopped. The rhythm had only paused to wait for me to notice, and now a new cycle had begun, perfectly timed, perfectly executed. The same pattern, the same attention to detail, the same ritualistic care. And I knew, with a clarity that was almost unbearable, that I was being singled out. I tried to call the police, old colleagues, anyone who might help. But who could explain patterns this intricate, disappearances this precise, and a threat so invisible it left no trace? They would dismiss me as paranoid, obsessed, a relic of past investigations. I was alone. I had always been alone with this. And now the stakes had risen. I was no longer just investigating. I was part of the sequence. I sat at my desk, maps spread before me, tracing lines with my finger, counting intervals, memorizing the triangles, the angles, the repetitions. I felt the pull of the pattern around me, subtle, insistent, like a heartbeat in the walls. And I knew that if I stopped noticing, if I let go, the rhythm would continue without me. But if I stayed, I risked becoming the next disappearance, another node in the lattice of horror. The choice was not mine. Awareness had chosen for me. As the night deepened, I felt it again. a presence at the edge of perception. Just beyond the light of my desk lamp, watching, waiting. The city outside was silent, ordinary yet alive with its hidden rhythm, and I knew with a chill that settled into my bones that the pattern was complete. Only one thing remained, the next move, and that move was mine to anticipate, or fail to anticipate, because the game had resumed. The case was reopened, and I had no illusions about what that meant. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. I remember it because the sky was gray, low clouds pressing against the city like a weight, and the wind carried a chill that seeped through the cracks in my apartment windows. I was at my desk, maps spread out, eyes bloodshot from hours of tracing patterns, when I noticed the envelope. Plain, no return address, no stamp I recognized. Just my name, typed neatly in black ink. I hesitated before opening it. My hands shook. There was a part of me that wanted to leave it unopened, to pretend ignorance, to believe that the nightmares I'd chased for decades would not reach into my real life. But another part of me, stubborn, obsessive, foolish, knew I had to see it. I had to know. Inside was a single sheet of paper, edges clean, the text typed in the same precise black font. My eyes skimmed it, and my stomach sank as the words formed a sentence that froze me in place. Details about the first disappearance I had investigated. Names, locations, times. Specific, intimate details no one could have known unless they had been there, unless they had orchestrated it. I dropped the paper on the desk and ran my hands over my face. I could feel my pulse in my temples. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't a prank. This was someone, or something, talking directly to me, proving knowledge that should have been impossible. The second letter came 2 days later. This time, the envelope was slightly different, thicker, heavier, almost textured like a rough skin. Inside, another sheet of paper. More details, more confirmations of disappearances only I had access to in my files. But there was something new. A sentence at the bottom that made my chest tighten. "You've been counting for too long. Now we count you." I sat there staring at the words as the room seemed to grow smaller. The air felt heavy, thick with the presence I had always sensed but never named. Patterns had always been patient, precise. But now the letters made it personal. The game had shifted. I wasn't just watching anymore. I was being watched, targeted. Sleep became impossible. Every sound, a creak, a gust of wind, a distant siren made me jump. Shadows seemed to move just at the edge of my vision. I caught myself staring at corners for hours, convinced someone, or something, was waiting there. The rational part of my mind reminded me that these were letters, ordinary mail. But another part of me, a part I had ignored for years, screamed that this was the culmination of every disappearance I had ever studied. I went back to the files, desperate for logic, for a clue, for anything that could explain why I had been singled out. I traced patterns again, checked dates, locations, victims. Every letter, every note I had received aligned perfectly with the maps, the symbols, the sequences. The orchestrator was close. They knew what I knew, and I realized, with a chill that spread through me like ice, that nothing would protect me from the rhythm now. Then came the third letter. This one was different, heavier, sealed with a wax stamp that left an impression I couldn't recognize. I hesitated, staring at it on the kitchen table for what felt like hours. Finally, with trembling hands, I broke the seal and unfolded the sheet inside. It contained photographs, images of my apartment, my street, even my desk, captured at times when I was certain no one could have been watching. The handwriting, elegant and precise, typed beneath the photos read, "You've seen the pattern. Now you are part of it. We are coming for you next." The paper slipped from my hands and I sank into the chair, unable to breathe properly. I wanted to tell myself it was a joke, some elaborate prank. But the cold certainty settled over me. This was no prank. This was the inevitable conclusion of decades of disappearances. A rhythm I had begun to trace and had now become entwined in. I thought about the victims. The children, the teenagers, the adults whose faces haunted me from old photographs. And now I realized that the same meticulous care that had taken them would be applied to me. I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was the next node, the next point in the invisible lattice of terror. The letters kept coming. Each one contained more details, more photographs, more evidence that I was being watched with unerring precision. They described my routines, my habits, the streets I walked, the stores I visited. Nothing was private. Nothing was safe. The pattern had extended into my life, tracing my steps, anticipating my actions. I tried to hide, to change routines, to go unnoticed. But it was futile. Every choice I made was predicted, every movement anticipated. The letters were proof that I had already entered the sequence. The orchestrator was patient, precise, aware of my obsession. And patience, I realized with a shiver, was far more terrifying than haste. One night, I sat at my desk, letters stacked in a neat pile beside me. I stared at the latest photo, a picture of my living room taken just minutes before I found it. And I understood the horrifying truth. The pattern had eyes. It had always had eyes. And now it was aware of mine. I felt a presence in the room then, not physical, not tangible, but unmistakable. Watching, waiting. A subtle shift in the air, a pressure against my chest, a whisper that seemed to brush against the edges of my mind. And I knew without a doubt that the orchestrator, whatever force or person it was, had chosen me. I was next. I looked back at the maps, the charts, the photographs, the symbols I had traced for years. They no longer represented abstract puzzles or cold cases. They were a countdown, a series of steps leading inexorably to me. And I realized, with a terror that made my hands shake uncontrollably, that there was no escaping, no avoiding. I had been marked the moment I began to see. The letters were not threats. They were confirmations, instructions, messages delivered with cold, meticulous care. The orchestrator had been patient for decades, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to trace the invisible lines. And now that someone was me. I could feel the dread settle deep into my bones, a weight I could not lift. Years of chasing patterns, of investigating disappearances had led to this. The files, the maps, the photographs, they had been a warning, a rehearsal. And now, the final act had begun. I stared at the latest letter again. The words burned into my memory. We are coming for you next. And I knew it was true. Not a threat, not a promise, a fact. A conclusion written in the invisible lines I had spent years tracing. In the shadows I had learned to notice. In the rhythm I could no longer escape. I sat in the dark. The letters spread before me, unable to move, unable to think. Only able to feel the cold inevitability that had finally arrived. The orchestrator had been patient. I had been patient. And now, the sequence was complete. Because some patterns never end. Some rhythms continue until the last note has been played. And some shadows wait for the final observer to enter the lattice before closing around them completely. I understood that I had seen it all too late. And I understood, with a terror that would not let go, that I was the final note. I didn't think I would be so nervous. Standing outside apartment 6B, keys clutched in my sweaty hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to step into a place that had been waiting for me. The building smelled faintly of mildew and paint, the walls a dull beige that had faded unevenly from years of sun and neglect. My reflection in the glass door looked strange, smaller somehow, hunched, like the building itself was pressing down on me. The landlord had warned me the apartment had been empty for years. He didn't go into detail about why. Just some bad luck, he had muttered. I nodded, forcing a smile, though the pit in my stomach had been growing ever since he mentioned the previous tenants. 4 deaths, unexplained, all tied to 6B. Most people wouldn't have touched it. But I needed the rent to be manageable, and this place was practically a steal. The door clicked open, and a cold draft hit me immediately, slicing through the warmth of the afternoon. I shivered. The apartment smelled faintly of old wood and dust, a sweetness underneath that I couldn't place. The floorboards groaned under my weight, whispering as I crossed the threshold, as if warning me not to come any further. I dropped my boxes near the kitchen and wandered through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The walls were bare, peeling slightly in corners, and the curtains were a dusty gray that barely filtered the sunlight. It wasn't exactly cozy, but I tried to imagine what I could do with it. Maybe some string lights, a rug, a plant or two. I wanted to believe I could make it mine. In the bedroom, the air felt heavier. The window was open just a crack, letting in a breeze that didn't belong. I could see the street below, but it was strangely muted. The colors drained as if someone had dimmed the world outside. I pulled the window closed and pressed my hand against the glass, and for a moment I thought I saw something move across the floor behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just the empty room, silent and patient. My heartbeat thundered, and I laughed nervously at myself. I had moved enough times to know how my imagination could play tricks in a new space. The bathroom was small, with cracked tiles and a mirror that seemed slightly off-kilter. I noticed smudges in the glass, dark fingerprints I couldn't reach. I wiped at them, expecting to see dust, but instead only streaks appeared. I frowned, my reflection wiggling strangely as I moved. For a second, I thought I saw someone else there, a shadow flitting just behind my shoulder. I blinked, and it was gone. Unpacking the kitchen, I tried to distract myself. Pots, pans, dishes, ordinary things. I set them neatly on the counters, imagining the life I would live here. Cooking, reading by the window, listening to the faint hum of the city below. But every time I looked around, I felt watched. Not by a person, I told myself, but by the apartment itself, stretching and waiting, breathing quietly in corners. I found a closet tucked near the entrance. The door squeaked when I opened it, revealing an empty space except for the smell, old, iron-like, and strangely sweet. I shivered again, shutting it quickly, trying to push the feeling down. I didn't want to think about who had been here before. I didn't want to imagine them leaving, suddenly, without explanation. By the time I started unpacking my clothes, the sun had shifted, casting long, uneven shadows across the floor. I noticed that some corners of the apartment were darker than they should be. Even in the afternoon, patches of shadow clung stubbornly to the walls, corners where light didn't touch. I told myself it was just the angle of the sun. I tried not to look directly into them. As evening crept in, I made a small dinner, the smell of sautéing vegetables filling the apartment. I hoped it would make the place feel lived in, safe. But even with the stove running, the apartment seemed to breathe around me, listening. Every creak of the pipes, every sigh of the floorboard sounded louder, almost deliberate. I tried to keep myself busy, unpacking books and arranging the living room, but I couldn't shake the sense of intrusion, as if someone had already set up residence in my mind. I went to hang a painting I'd brought, a simple landscape. As I hammered the nail into the wall, the apartment seemed to pulse around me. The air thickened. I imagined the paint peeling, the walls shrinking, closing in on me. I stopped and stepped back, staring at the blank space where the painting hung. For a moment, I could swear I saw a figure leaning against the far wall, pale and still, watching. I blinked. Nothing. Just the empty apartment waiting. When night fell, I left the lights off for a while, thinking the apartment might feel less suffocating in darkness. I sat on the floor, my back against the cold wall, listening. The building was silent, but not peaceful. Somewhere maybe inside the walls, a faint ticking echoed. Not a clock. Something slower, deliberate. I tried to read, tried to focus on the words in my book, but every page felt heavy, the sentences stretching, twisting. I felt the apartment's attention like a weight pressing on my shoulders. Eventually, I set the book aside and curled up on the couch. My eyelids grew heavy, but sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw corners of the room shift, doors I hadn't noticed creaking, shadows pooling in impossible shapes. I imagined the previous tenants, who had died here, how they must have felt. Fear? Panic? Did they see the same corners moving, the same shadows stretching across the floor at night? I swallowed hard, trying not to dwell. But even as I drifted toward sleep, I felt it. Just the faintest brush of cold air against my neck, like a sigh, a whisper too soft to hear. I sat up quickly, scanning the room. Nothing, just the apartment, empty, patient, watching me adjust to its presence. I told myself I was tired, that my mind was playing tricks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that apartment 6B had been waiting for someone. And now, it had me. I lay back down, pulling a blanket tight around myself. But the air seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest. I tried to count my breaths. Tried to convince myself it was just the nerves, just the excitement of moving into a new place. But somewhere deep inside, I knew it was something else. something patient, something that didn't like being ignored. Sleep came eventually, but it was shallow, broken by the creaks of the floorboards and the subtle whispers of the wind through cracked windows. I woke several times, each time feeling a presence at the edge of my awareness, just beyond sight. By morning, I was exhausted, tense, and strangely exhilarated. Apartment 6B was mine now, and it had noticed me. The apartment had been mine for barely a week when I started noticing the drafts. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, the old windows letting in more wind than they should. But there were moments when the air turned unnaturally cold in places it shouldn't. Patches of ice along the living room floor, a chill crawling across the bedroom, brushing my skin like icy fingers. I would shiver and pull my sweater tighter, convinced I had left a window open somewhere, but the windows were always shut. It started small. I'd reach for my coffee cup and notice it had shifted a few inches from where I left it. I shrugged it off at first, thinking I had been tired, clumsy, or forgetful. But then it happened again and again. A spoon on the counter now facing the wrong way. My shoes, neatly lined by the door, scattered across the hall. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was a rhythm to it, as if the apartment had a way of arranging things that made sense to itself. One evening, the temperature dropped so sharply that I could see my breath inside the living room. I wrapped myself in blankets, trying to read a book, but the words blurred. And then I heard it, a faint sound at first, like the scraping of nails across a chalkboard. It came from the bedroom. I froze, heart hammering, and listened. The sound stopped. I told myself it was the building settling again. Old pipes creaking floorboards. Nothing more. But the next night, it wasn't just sounds. It was whispers. I couldn't make out words, only the cadence, soft, deliberate, just at the edge of hearing. I would stop in the middle of folding laundry or washing dishes, and the whispers would fade. Sometimes they seemed to follow me from room to room, brushing against my consciousness, just beyond the reach of recognition. I began to avoid certain corners, certain rooms at night. The bedroom was the worst. I started noticing that the drafts were stronger there, curling around me when I tried to sleep. Sometimes, I would wake to find the blankets pulled off, my clothes on the floor in disarray. I told myself it was me, sleepwalking perhaps. But deep down I knew it wasn't. I could feel a presence lingering, watching, learning. I began documenting it. Notes on my phone, small reminders of the strange occurrences. The placement of objects, the timing of the drafts, the whispers. It became a ritual, a way to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining it. But the more I recorded, the more the apartment seemed to respond. One morning, I found my notes scattered across the floor, torn in half. My pen was lying on top of them, perfectly intact. I froze, staring at it. Someone or something was sending me a message. I started noticing shadows in corners that shouldn't exist. They were subtle at first, just a smudge at the edge of my vision. But slowly, they grew more defined. Shapes that seemed to linger even when I looked directly at them. I would turn quickly, heart in my throat, and the room would be empty. And yet, the feeling of being watched never left me. One night, I heard a door click. Not the front door, not the apartment door. One of the smaller closets, or maybe the bathroom. I wasn't sure. I held my breath, straining to listen. The air was unnaturally still. And then a low, dragging sound echoed across the living room floor, like something heavy being pulled along. My mind raced. There was nothing there. And yet, I could feel it. The weight, the presence, the certainty that I was not alone. I tried talking to it once. I whispered, barely audible, "If you're here, please leave me alone." My voice sounded strange in the empty apartment, too loud, too exposed. Silence answered me, thick and oppressive. I sat on the couch, hugging my knees, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then I felt it, like a cold breath across the back of my neck, deliberate, watching. I spun around. Nothing, just shadows, stretching, waiting. The coldness followed me everywhere. Even in the kitchen, I felt it pooling around my feet, climbing up my legs. My hands would tingle, the skin crawling with goosebumps, and sometimes I saw my breath rising in the air, even though the radiator was on. I began sleeping in layers, pulling blankets over my head, trying to trap some warmth. It didn't help. The cold wasn't from the air. It was from something else, something alive in its own way. Objects continued to move. I would wake to find chairs pulled away from the table, books fallen from shelves, and once, my keys resting in the middle of the bathroom sink. I started checking locks and windows obsessively, even though I knew no one could have entered. Every movement felt purposeful, like the apartment itself had a will, arranging its world around me. I noticed the drafts had patterns. Certain rooms, certain corners, the bedroom, the living room, the hall outside the kitchen. They were strongest at night, creeping along the floor like water seeping under doors. I tried sealing cracks, stuffing towels in gaps. It made no difference. The air still found me, curling around me, whispering. It wasn't just cold. Sometimes the air felt heavy, almost sticky, pressing against my skin, making every movement sluggish. I began avoiding those corners entirely. I didn't sit in the living room after dark. I didn't linger in the bedroom past bedtime. I moved like a cautious intruder in my own apartment, constantly aware of eyes that weren't mine watching. Then came the night of the scratching. I woke suddenly. Sure, I had heard nails scraping against wood. It was coming from the walls, low and deliberate, circling the apartment. My pulse raced, my head pounding. I pressed my ear against the living room wall. The sound stopped. I leaned closer. Then a whisper, a breath of air across my cheek. My name. I jerked back. The room was empty. I started talking to the previous tenants in my head. 4 deaths, all tied to this apartment. What did they see? What did they feel? Did they hear the same whispers, feel the same drafts, the same weight pressing against their chests? I felt connected to them even though I didn't want to. Apartment 6B was a trap, a test, or maybe a game, and now I was part of it. Some nights I would lie awake, counting shadows instead of sheep, waiting for the next movement. I would trace my fingers along the walls, trying to feel solid ground, something real. But the apartment shifted. The air changed. Even in light, the shadows were alive, curling at the edges of the rooms, waiting, patient. I stopped trusting my own senses. Mirrors became dangerous. Reflections seemed delayed, off by just a fraction, showing something that wasn't quite me. Sometimes I would see movement behind me in the glass, and when I turned, nothing was there. And yet the feeling remained. A gaze, heavy, almost tender in its attention, yet threatening. I began sleeping less, eating less. I walked through the apartment like a ghost myself, careful not to disturb it, careful not to make it angry. And still, the cold breezes, the whispers, the movements continued. Sometimes I thought I felt a hand brush mine, soft and cold, as I reached for a book on the shelf. I would jerk back, heart hammering. Nothing, only air, only shadows, only apartment 6B, patient, waiting. I started keeping my doors open, the lights on, hoping that visibility would keep it at bay. But the darkness seemed to follow me anyway, pooling where the light couldn't reach, curling around corners and edges. The cold found me even under blankets, even under layers of sweaters. I had to accept it. The apartment was alive in some way, and I was not alone. The drafts were no longer just air. They were messages. They were warnings. I didn't understand what it wanted or why it had chosen me, but I could feel it shaping my life, twisting my nights, creeping into my dreams. Every night I fell asleep to the sound of whispers, and every morning I woke unsure which movements were mine and which belonged to something else. I knew I had to stay. I couldn't leave, not yet. Something about leaving felt wrong, as if it had already claimed me, even before I realized it. So I endured. I counted the drafts, noted the whispers, traced the shadows that lingered just out of reach. I lived in the apartment's rhythm, waiting, listening, fearing. Apartment 6B was patient, and I was learning to be patient too. It started with the smell. Not the usual must of the apartment, but something sharper, older, like decaying paper mixed with iron. I was cleaning the closet by the hallway, trying to make it feel more like mine, when I noticed a loose panel at the back. I had never paid it much attention before. The panel was warped, splintered, and for some reason I felt compelled to pull it aside. Behind it, I found a small, dusty compartment, and inside were 3 leather-bound journals. Their covers were cracked, the pages yellowed and brittle, the edges curling from age and neglect. I picked one up carefully, heart thudding. The leather was cold under my fingers, and for a moment I thought I felt a pulse, faint, almost imperceptible, as if it remembered the hands that had held it before. The first journal was filled with neat, deliberate handwriting. I flipped through the pages slowly, aware of every creak in the floorboards and every whisper of the drafts. It belonged to the previous tenant, a woman like me who had moved in years ago. Her words were careful at first, describing the apartment in mundane detail, but the tone shifted quickly. The entries grew frantic, paranoid. She wrote about cold drafts, about objects moving when she wasn't looking, about whispers that called her name. She described shadows pooling in corners, darker than they should be, stretching and shifting even in daylight. And then she mentioned him, the resident shadow. At first I thought it was metaphorical, a way of describing her fear. But the more I read, the more I realized she meant it literally. She wrote about a presence that had taken shape, a figure that lurked just out of sight, always watching, waiting. She called it patient, deliberate, something alive that learned and adapted. The second journal was even more disturbing. It belonged to the tenant before her. His handwriting was messy, jagged, as if he wrote while trembling. He spoke of the apartment as if it had a will of its own, describing how the shadows seemed to follow him, pressing against his mind, twisting his thoughts. He wrote about waking in the night to find objects in impossible places, cold air crawling across his skin, and the whispers, soft, mocking, inhuman. There was one entry I couldn't get out of my head. He described waking to see a figure in the doorway, tall, dark, faceless, staring. He wrote that he tried to move, to scream, to run, but he couldn't. By the time he blinked, it had vanished, leaving him alone, trembling, and forever changed. The entry ended abruptly. The handwriting stopped. The page was blank after that. The third journal was the worst. It belonged to a man who had lived there before the first two tenants. His entries were sporadic, chaotic, filled with scribbles and frantic underlines. He called it the Watcher, describing how it learned his routines, predicted his movements, and sometimes, he swore, mimicked him, moving like him, breathing like him, filling the apartment with echoes of his own life. He wrote about hiding in closets, under beds, behind locked doors, only to feel its presence pressing closer, closer, until it was inside him, in his mind, in his body. A shadow coiled around his very thoughts. And finally, the last entry was just a single line, scrawled in panic. "It knows me. It is inside me. Don't let it find you." I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling. My apartment was quiet, but the silence was thick, almost suffocating. I could feel the drafts brushing past me, cooler than usual, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow move across the floor, just beyond the edge of the light. I told myself it was impossible. I was alone. But the journals were proof. I wasn't imagining it. It had been here long before me, and now I was next. I started carrying one of the journals with me everywhere in the apartment, reading it under the harsh light of the living room, under blankets in bed, trying to understand what I was dealing with. I needed rules, a pattern, something that could help me survive. But the more I read, the more I realized there were no rules. The shadow didn't play by human logic. It waited, it learned, and it adapted. I noticed changes almost immediately. The drafts became colder, sharper, more deliberate. Objects moved more frequently, sometimes when I was staring right at them. Whispers became clearer, almost forming words I couldn't understand. The shadows grew darker, pooling in corners, stretching along the walls, curling around the edges of furniture. And always, I felt it watching. It wasn't just the cold or the whispers that unnerved me. It was the certainty, the way it seemed to know my routines, my habits. I would wake up to find my belongings rearranged in ways that mirrored my movements earlier in the day, as if it was practicing, learning, becoming more intimate with my life. The apartment itself felt alive now, every corner a part of its consciousness. One night, I tried to leave the journals behind, thinking maybe I was inviting it by carrying them around. But when I returned to the closet, the panel was closed again. The journals were gone. I looked around, heart hammering. The cold air brushed my neck, soft, deliberate. And then I heard a whisper. Closer this time, almost in my ear. I could feel the breath, icy, damp, and the words were clear. Impossibly clear. "Don't hide from me." I dropped to the floor, clutching the air like I could hold it. But it passed through me, leaving only a sense of suffocating inevitability. The journals reappeared the next morning, stacked neatly on the living room table as if waiting for me. I didn't touch them for hours, staring at them from the couch, unwilling to face what knowledge they contained. But I had to. I had no choice. I needed to understand. The first journal detailed the shadow's habits, the way it learned from the people it hunted. It didn't attack immediately. It waited, studied, and tested. It learned fear, weakness, patterns of sleep and thought. And then, when it was ready, it struck. Not violently, but subtly, psychologically, slowly eroding its prey until nothing remained. I began to notice myself changing. My thoughts became sharper, more suspicious. I double-checked locks, triple-checked windows. I tracked the movement of objects, tried to anticipate the drafts, the cold spots. I even began speaking to it sometimes, in whispers, testing its reactions. It responded. Not in words, not in direct action, but in presence. The air shifted, the shadows stretched, objects nudged slightly out of place. Always, the message was the same. It knew. I started sleeping with the lights on, sitting upright on the couch, clutching a journal like a lifeline. Dreams were no refuge. The shadow appeared there too, faceless, patient, circling, watching. Sometimes it mimicked people I knew, voices I recognized, twisting them just enough to make my skin crawl. I woke drenched in sweat, heart racing, feeling it still there, lingering in the apartment even after morning light. I thought about leaving. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape before it learned too much, before it attached itself completely. But every time I tried to pack, I couldn't. Doors would jam, objects would fall in impossible ways, shadows pooling along the threshold, refusing me. It was as if apartment 6B had already marked me. I wasn't allowed to leave. The journals became my guide, my only comfort. Each one detailed the failures, the slow terror, the inevitable surrender of the previous tenants. But hidden in some of the older pages were notes in the margins, small, desperate tips. Do not acknowledge it more than necessary. Keep lights, keep movement. Sleep in shifts. It cannot tolerate defiance. Defiance. I clung to that word, repeating it under my breath as I moved carefully through the apartment. I tried small acts of rebellion, leaving objects where they didn't belong, ignoring whispers, touching shadows with bare hands. Sometimes it responded with nothing, sometimes with the tiniest shift in the cold or a barely perceptible creak. I began cataloging its reactions, learning like it had learned from the tenants before me. Even with knowledge, fear never left me. Each night I waited for the whispers to grow louder, the cold to intensify, the shadows to reach out. And every night I felt its presence closer, patient, deliberate, waiting for the moment it could finally strike or claim me entirely. The journals were proof. They were a warning. They were a promise. I was not alone, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be. I had been living in apartment 6B for nearly a month when the nights became unbearable. The cold drafts, the whispers, the moving objects, they had grown sharper, more deliberate, as if the apartment itself was learning my habits, predicting my every movement. I slept less, ate less, spoke less. The journals were my only anchor, the only proof that I hadn't entirely lost my mind. That night I couldn't sleep. I had the lights on, every lamp burning in a weak attempt to keep the darkness at bay. But even under the harsh glow, shadows pooled in corners, thick and unnatural, curling along the edges of the walls. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but the air felt heavier, pressing against my chest, whispering against my skin. I was in the living room, curled on the couch, journal in hand, when I felt it. Something standing in the doorway of the bedroom. My heart stopped, every muscle frozen. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The shadow was there, a presence more than a shape, darker than anything natural. It didn't step forward. It didn't need to. Its attention alone was enough to make my limbs tremble, to make the room feel smaller, tighter. I wanted to scream, to run, to grab anything to defend myself, but my body refused. I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and knowing, pressing into my mind. I remembered the journals, the desperate warnings of the previous tenants, the entries about waking to a figure, faceless and patient. I was living the same nightmare. The shadow didn't move. It just watched, silent, patient. I could feel it learning me, memorizing my fear, savoring the way my chest heaved, the way my eyes darted from corner to corner. I wanted to cry, but my tears wouldn't come. I wanted to run, but the apartment seemed to contract, every step impossible. I was trapped. I whispered its name, almost involuntarily. "Who? What are you?" My voice trembled. There was no answer, only the presence, pressing, lingering, suffocating. I realized then that it didn't need words. Its existence alone was communication, a slow, creeping terror that seeped into every corner of the apartment, every thought in my head. I tried to recall the tips from the journals, small acts of defiance. Don't acknowledge it more than necessary. Keep lights, keep movement, sleep in shifts. But it was too late. It had learned me already, understood my patterns, my weaknesses. It had waited, patient, silent, until the moment it could fully assert itself. I remembered the nights of whispers, the shifting objects, the cold brushing across my skin. They weren't random. They were preparation, training, testing. And now, here it was, fully aware, fully conscious, staring at me from the threshold. I couldn't see features. I didn't need to. I knew it was looking at me, and I knew that whatever it wanted, it had been waiting for this. I stood, almost automatically clutching the journal like a talisman. I felt its presence respond, like ripples across the air, bending around me, testing, gauging my resolve. I whispered, I won't let you. But my voice cracked, failing me, swallowed by the weight of the apartment. It moved then. Not with steps, not with motion I could track. It was suddenly closer, the air thicker, colder, pressing against my skin, seeping into my clothes, curling around my heart. My limbs grew numb. I couldn't breathe properly. I fell to my knees, clutching my chest, and for a moment, I thought it would take me. Then something strange happened. It paused, almost as if it were curious, waiting to see what I would do. I crawled backward slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadow. It didn't follow. It didn't retreat. It just observed, patient, deliberate, like a predator studying its prey before the kill. I remembered the warnings about defiance. I took a shaky breath and stood again. My knees shook. My voice was barely a whisper. I am not yours, I said, louder this time, a thread of determination in the tremor. The shadow responded. Not visibly, but I could feel it, as if the air itself recoiled for a moment. The cold intensified, swirling around me, but it didn't advance. I spent hours like that, standing, speaking, refusing to sit or hide, refusing to let it understand that I was afraid. The apartment's usual whispers came, soft and mocking, testing me, but I answered each one with my own voice, steadying myself, refusing to yield. I didn't know if it was enough. I didn't know if I would survive. But for the first time, I felt a flicker of control, however small. By dawn, the shadow was gone, or at least it receded into the corners, patient as ever, fading into the background. The drafts returned to their usual subtle chill, the objects settled, and the apartment exhaled. I slumped against the wall, exhausted, trembling, my thoughts scattered and heavy. I knew it hadn't left. It never would. Apartment 6B didn't allow that, but I had survived the night. I thought about the journals. I realized then that they weren't just warnings, they were guides, lessons from those who had come before. Their mistakes, their terror, their final thoughts, they were all part of a chain, a survival thread, and now I was part of it. I had learned, just as they had learned, to live in the shadows world without surrendering entirely. The apartment didn't feel safe. It never would. But I could exist here, cautiously, carefully, aware of its presence, aware of its gaze. I understood finally that survival wasn't about defeating it. It was about knowing its rules, walking its edge, respecting its patience while guarding my own mind, my own life. I moved through the apartment carefully that day. arranging my belongings, checking the corners, keeping lights on, moving deliberately. Every creak of the floorboards, every subtle draft was a reminder of the shadow's attention, a constant vigilance I had to maintain. I could feel its patience lingering just beyond my perception, shaping the apartment around me, testing me silently. That night, I didn't wait for the shadow to announce itself. I sat with the lights on, journal open, writing my own notes, recording my experiences, just as the others had. I whispered to the apartment as I wrote, acknowledging it without fear, naming it without submission. It listened. I knew it did. Hours passed. The shadows stretched and curled. The cold brushed my skin, but I didn't flinch. I didn't leave. I stayed awake until exhaustion claimed me, curled in the couch with the lights on, the journal clutched like a lifeline. And when I finally slept, it was shallow, filled with dreams where the shadows watched, always at the edge, patient and deliberate, waiting. Morning came, gray and muted. I looked around the apartment, every corner familiar now, every shadow accounted for. Apartment 6B was not friendly. It was not kind. It was alive in its own way, patient, intelligent, waiting. But I was here. I existed within its rules, aware, careful, determined. I knew I couldn't leave. I knew I couldn't escape. The shadow had claimed this place, and I had chosen, or been chosen, to live within it. But I also knew something else. Survival wasn't about running. Survival was about recognition, about acknowledgement, about finding the small, stubborn flicker of life that refused to be consumed. And I had found that flicker. I was awake, now, alert, cautious, but alive. Apartment. 6B had noticed me, and I had noticed it too. Was my third week on the night shift, when I started noticing that some calls didn't sound right. You learn fast in this job to tune out the usual noise, drunken fights, car crashes, barking dogs, but these calls, they felt different. They carried a weight, like a shadow pressing against the line. I remember the first one clearly. The phone rang just past midnight. The screen flashed unknown. I answered like I always did. "Mawan, what's your emergency?" I said, voice steady, practiced, no reply. Just a low breathing, uneven and wet, like someone had been running. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to ping a location, but nothing came through. Then a whisper, soft, curling through the static. "Help me." It was thin, almost childlike, but the panic in it was real enough that my heart stuttered. "Where are you?" I asked. Silence. I tried again. "Can you tell me your location?" Then a click and the line went dead. I sat there, hand on the receiver, staring at the empty screen, my chest tight. I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice had been close, too close, like it had been in the room with me. That night, the calls kept coming. Not all of them, just enough to make my skin crawl. Some were ordinary, car accidents, medical emergencies. But others, well, they sounded like they came from a place that wasn't here. One call, I remember, came through at 2:17 a.m. The voice was male, low, trembling, and it didn't say words at first. Just a sound, like metal scraping over stone, slow, deliberate. My hand gripped the receiver tighter. "Wevin," I said. My voice shook, though I didn't want it to. The sound stopped, replaced by breathing. Heavy, controlled. Then words. "They're watching, always watching." I frowned at the screen. There was no location, no signal, just nothing. "You need help?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. The line went dead again. Every instinct in me screamed that the call hadn't ended. It had never really started. Something was lingering in the silence. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on the mundane calls. The ones with addresses, names, and clear emergencies. It was a tactic I had learned from my training. When you can't fix it, compartmentalize it. But that night, compartmentalizing failed. Every time I picked up the receiver, I felt eyes on the back of my neck, waiting, patient, watching. Around 3 a.m., I got a call from a woman whose voice was panicked and frantic. She was screaming about shadows moving in her house, about hearing voices calling her name. Usually, I could calm people down. I could get them to breathe, to focus, to think. But this woman, she sounded like she wasn't just afraid. She sounded like she knew something. "They're inside the walls," she said, and I thought she was joking at first. People say strange things when they're scared. But her voice, it carried certainty. "Ma'am, can you describe them?" I asked. There was a pause, and then a sound that made my stomach turn. A voice, distorted, almost layered over her own. And it said my name, Alex. Alex, I froze. My heart hammered. I had never heard anyone call me on a call before. Not in my personal life, not like this. I tried to speak, but my throat went dry. "Ma'am?" I managed, and then the line went silent. After that, the calls got stranger. I began noticing patterns I couldn't explain. Some of them were wrong, people speaking in languages I didn't recognize, children crying in a rhythm that wasn't human, or voices that repeated my own words back to me, slightly delayed, slightly warped, like echoes, but too intelligent, too aware. I started keeping notes. I wrote down every number, every word, every sound, but even as I wrote, I felt the weight of it pressing closer. I didn't want to answer. I wanted to run, but this was my job. I was trained to stay, to listen, to respond. One call, around 4:45 a.m., is the one that stays with me. The line was dead silent for nearly 30 seconds, and then breathing. Slow, deep, deliberate, and then a whisper. "Do you want to see them?" I laughed nervously into the receiver. "Sir, I can't. Another whisper, this one colder. "They're behind you." I spun in my chair. The office was empty. My coworker's station was dark. Nothing moved. But the hairs on my neck stood on end. I could hear my own breathing, too loud, too fast. The line went dead. I didn't pick it up again for several minutes. I stared at the phone, willing it to ring, willing it not to ring. Every time it rang after that, I flinched. I hated the ringing. It meant something was waiting, something not human. By the end of my shift, my hands were shaking. I didn't tell anyone what I had heard. No one would believe me. They never did. They thought I was tired, stressed. Maybe I was. But there was something in those calls, something that wasn't just a human voice, something that knew me, that could reach me through the phone, through the air, through the walls. I left the station in silence, walking to my car under the streetlights that flickered like they were struggling to stay on. I couldn't get the voices out of my head. Every shadow seemed to move when I glanced at it. Every reflection in a window looked like someone was behind me. I kept thinking about that first call, the one that whispered, "Help me." I still don't know who or what it was, and I don't think I ever will. But I know this. The line wasn't just a line. It was a doorway. And something was waiting on the other side. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. And then, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I didn't answer, but I could hear it in my mind. The same whisper, thin and urgent. "Alex." And I realized that the night wasn't over. It had just begun. After that first night, I started noticing something consistent. The calls weren't random. They were targeted. Personal. I'd been a 911 operator for years, and I thought I'd heard everything. But these voices, they weren't just on the line. They were in my head before I even picked up. It began around 1:03 a.m. A number I didn't recognize lit up my screen. I hesitated. My thumb hovered over the receiver. And then I heard it. Before I even answered, the whisper, "Alex." I swallowed hard and lifted the phone. "One, what's your emergency?" A man's voice answered, soft, distorted, like it had been run through some broken speaker. "They're here," he said. "Who's here?" I asked, instinctively typing into the system. People who shouldn't exist. They take them, the ones who don't belong. "You know the place?" I frowned. I don't know what you mean. Can you give me an address?" Static. Then a voice layered on top of the first, female this time. "Map won't help you. Maps can't see them. You can't see them either." Not yet, I froze. Something about the tone, the layering of voices, made me feel like I was standing at the edge of a cliff I couldn't see. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Another pause. Then, "Listen, watch. Don't answer if they call again. Don't try to speak." The line clicked dead. I sat there staring at the receiver, the cursor blinking on my screen. My fingers trembled, but I kept them on the keyboard. I couldn't stop. I had to record every word, every sound. The next few hours were a blur. Calls came in waves, sometimes normal emergencies, sometimes voices that described things that couldn't exist. One call, a child spoke about disappearing neighbors, names I had never heard, streets that didn't exist. But what unnerved me most wasn't the details, it was the certainty. The child didn't sound confused. They sounded like they had seen it all before. "They took him yesterday," the voice said. "And the walls. They breathe at night." I paused, swallowing. Walls don't breathe. Nothing breathes in walls. My rational mind screamed it, but my instincts told me to listen. And then there were the calls that described crimes as they were happening in real time. I remember one vividly. A man, voice trembling, describing a woman being dragged into an alley behind a building. He gave exact details, clothes, movements, the sounds she made, but the address didn't exist in our system. I ran it through every database, every map, every record we had. Nothing. Not even a construction site. I called the precinct, but they dismissed it. Probably a prank, they said. But there was nothing playful about the voice. It had been too desperate, too alive. By 3 a.m., I had a knot in my stomach. The calls were escalating. The voices weren't just distorted, they were layering over each other, overlapping, whispering my name, describing things I hadn't seen, places I hadn't been. Alex. Alex, they're behind the lights. Behind the lights? I spun in my chair, every shadow in the room lengthening. My coworker had left hours ago. The office felt empty, sterile, but alive. Like it was breathing around me. The next call was worse. The voice was soft, calm, almost too calm. And it was describing my apartment. Every detail. The furniture, the way I leave my shoes by the door, the exact number of books on my shelf. "You sleep at midnight," the voice said. "Always alone, always listening. They'll come tonight." I froze. I hadn't given anyone my home address. No one knew I lived alone. Not my friends, not my family. I looked around the room, heart hammering. The fluorescent lights above flickered. A cold draft whispered along my neck. I could hear my own breathing echoing in the empty office, and the line, still connected, hummed softly, waiting, watching. After that, I started hearing them even when the phone was silent. Whispers at the edge of my hearing, rustling in the vents, shadows that moved when I didn't move. And every time a call came in, the voice would be closer, more personal. Sometimes it wasn't even human, a low growl beneath the whisper, layered with a child's laugh or the metallic scrape of nails across concrete. Around 4:30 a.m., another call. This one made me freeze before I even answered. The number flashed unknown. I picked it up. "Alex," it said, slow, deliberate. "You shouldn't be here. They know you listen." Who knows me?" I whispered, clutching the receiver. "They know everything," the voice said. And then it began describing people I didn't know. Names, places, events, stories that seemed impossible. Like fragments of nightmares stitched together. I wrote them down anyway. I had to. Every detail mattered. Every word could be a warning, and then something changed. The voices started talking about me. Not just my apartment. Not just my routines. But my memories. My childhood. Things I hadn't told anyone. Secrets I hadn't even admitted to myself. "You hid under the bed," the voice said softly, almost lovingly. "You counted the cracks in the ceiling. You waited for them to leave. I couldn't breathe." My hands were trembling. The cursor on my computer blurred in my vision. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to run. But I didn't. I couldn't. The line went dead. I sat there in silence, listening to the hum of the office, listening to the darkness between the lights, listening to something moving just beyond my vision. By 5 a.m., I was exhausted, shaky, and unsteady. But I couldn't leave, not yet. Not until I understood what I was hearing, what I was seeing, what was calling me through the line. The last call before the morning shift arrived was the worst. A distorted voice like a choir of whispers, overlapping, layering over each other, speaking at once. "Alex, Alex, you know the way to see them, the way to hear, the way to vanish." I slammed the receiver down. My ears rang. My vision blurred. And for a moment I thought I heard my own voice answering from the receiver. "Yes, I see. I hear." I couldn't tell if it was me or them. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. They weren't just on the line. They weren't just voices. They were inside me, waiting, patient, layering over my thoughts, calling me closer. I left the station that morning in a daze, sunlight burning my eyes. Everyone else seemed oblivious to what I had endured. They laughed, drank coffee, flipped through the morning reports. And I couldn't tell them. I couldn't. They'd think I was insane. But I knew. I knew what I had heard. And I knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The voices would come back. They always came back. And the more I listened, the closer they got. By the time the third night rolled around, I wasn't sure if I was even awake anymore, or if I was trapped inside some distorted dream. The office lights hummed over my head. The computers glowed faintly. And the phone never stopped ringing. Or maybe it did. I couldn't tell anymore. It started around 12:47 a.m., a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, my hand hovering above the receiver. My stomach twisted. And then the whisper, "Alex." I swallowed. My fingers gripped the phone like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. "Juan, what's your emergency?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. A strange static answered. Low, bubbling, like water boiling in slow motion. Then faintly a voice overlaid it. My voice. My name. "Alex, I need help." I froze. My pulse slammed against my chest. It wasn't me. Not really, but it sounded exactly like me. The tone, the pitch, even the pauses I make when I talk. "Who is this?" I demanded. Silence. Then a click, and the line went dead. I sat there frozen, staring at the receiver. My hands were shaking. I could feel the cold sweat on my back. And in the quiet hum of the office, I swore I could hear. Me, whispering. Soft, thin, desperate. "Help. Help." I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was hallucinating. Maybe I was losing it. I'd been on night shifts for 3 weeks, barely sleeping, listening to voices that didn't belong anywhere. Maybe this was the breaking point, but it wasn't over. Not by far. The next call came at 1:12 a.m., unknown number. The line hissed with static before a voice broke through. Again, my voice. "I can't escape!" I wanted to hang up. I wanted to run. But my fingers were frozen to the receiver. I couldn't stop listening. "They're inside the walls," the voice whispered. "They watch you sleep. They know your secrets. They know you." Every hair on my body stood on end. My chest tightened. My stomach rolled. I pressed a hand to my face, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. But the voice continued, relentless. "You left the door unlocked. They know. They're coming." The line went dead again. I felt my sanity slipping. Each time a call came in, it wasn't just a voice. It was my voice. My memories, my fear, layered over the static like some cruel echo from the other side. Around 2:30 a.m., I got another call. This one was different. The static wasn't just white noise. It was moving, writhing, almost alive. I heard scratching, sharp metallic like claws across metal. Then faintly, the voice. "They hear you thinking. They're inside your head. Don't try to hide." I slammed the receiver down. I ran my hands through my hair. I needed air, needed to feel real. But even in the silence, even with the phone in my hand, I could hear it. The soft echo of my own voice, pleading, panicked, repeating my own words back to me. "Don't try to hide. Don't try to hide!" By 3:15 a.m., I was trembling. My notes were scattered across the desk, scribbled with frantic handwriting. Each call layered over the last, building a tapestry of sound that made no sense and yet made too much sense. Every whisper, every echo, every static-filled word was designed to break me down, to make me question everything I thought I knew. Then, around 4:02 a.m., the calls escalated further. I picked up the receiver. At first, just silence, then laughter. Soft, high-pitched, twisted. It overlapped my own voice screaming. And through it all, the static pulsed like a heartbeat in the line. "Alex," it said, "come to us. Come." I pressed the receiver to my ear, trying to block out the noise, trying to scream. But my voice was swallowed by static. And then the line shifted, warped. I heard my own memories described in detail. Conversations I had forgotten. Moments of shame, fear, regret. "They know you," the voice said. Every secret, every lie, every memory. You can't escape. I gripped the phone until my knuckles turned white. The static hummed louder, growing, pulsing like it had a rhythm. My own voice kept answering over and over, "Yes, yes, help me." I couldn't tell if it was me saying it or them, and the more I listened, the more I realized it didn't matter. They were inside the line, inside me. Everywhere I turned, everywhere I looked, I could hear whispers. My own voice repeating, layered, distorted. By 5 a.m., I was shaking so badly that I couldn't type. I could barely breathe. I didn't move. I just listened, pressed to the receiver, hoping the world would stay still, hoping the voices would stop. But they didn't. I heard something new then, a rhythm beneath the static, like a pattern, a message. My own voice whispering numbers, addresses, times, places I had never been, people I had never met, and yet I felt the pull, the compulsion to follow, to answer, to go to them. I slammed the phone down again. The echoes in my head were deafening. My own voice, warped, layered, repeating over and over, "You will come, you will come." I couldn't sleep that morning. I left the station in a daze, the sun burning my eyes. I barely made it to my apartment before collapsing on the couch. My phone buzzed. Unknown number. I didn't answer. But the static, the whispering, it followed me. In my mind, behind my eyes, echoing, and then something terrifying happened. I heard it clear as day, not through the phone, not in a dream. "Alex." I bolted upright. My apartment was empty. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed. And yet, I could feel them, watching, waiting, in the walls, in the corners, in the empty spaces between furniture. I realized then that it wasn't just the calls. It wasn't just the static. They had found a way inside me, inside my mind. And no matter what I did, no matter how much I tried to block them out, I couldn't escape. By the time the morning shift arrived, I was a wreck. My hands shook. My eyes were red and bloodshot. I couldn't look anyone in the eye. And though they asked if I was okay, I couldn't answer. How could I? How could I explain that my own voice was calling me from another place? That the static had become alive? That I was being drawn into something I couldn't see and couldn't fight? I didn't leave the station that day. I couldn't. Not yet. I had to stay. I had to keep listening. Because I knew if I hung up, if I stopped, they would come. And the last thing I wanted was for them to know I was afraid. Word count. 405. I didn't show up for my shift that morning. I couldn't. Not after what I had heard, what I had felt. My apartment felt wrong, heavy, pressed down with shadows that weren't shadows. The air itself seemed to thrum, vibrating with whispers I could feel more than hear. I had tried to sleep, tried to close my eyes, but every time I drifted, I woke to my own voice calling out. Soft, urgent, terrified, "Alex, Alex!" By evening, I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment. Not alone, not with the voices, not with the static in my head that now felt like it had teeth, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I left, walking the streets in a daze. The city was quiet for once, eerily still, as if it too was holding its breath. I didn't call anyone, didn't answer my phone. My mind kept replaying the last call from the station, the one that had changed everything. My voice layered over static, pleading, trembling, repeating things I hadn't said. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination. Lack of sleep, stress, the long nights of the shift. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had gotten into me. Through the phone, through the line. Something had followed me home. That night, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But the vibration pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat, relentless, calling me, and then the voice came, my voice. Clear, trembling, terrified, help! Help me! I dropped the phone. It clattered across the floor. I stumbled back, gasping, pressing my hands to my ears. But it didn't stop. Not in the apartment. Not in the street. Not in my head. I ran. I didn't know where, only away. Each shadow seemed to lean toward me. Each corner seemed to stretch, elongating to reach me. I could hear whispers overlapping my own thoughts, my own memories, distorted and urgent. Alex, come. I didn't know if it was me or them calling. And then I realized, with a cold clarity that froze my blood, that it didn't matter. The voice wasn't mine. It had just taken mine, and it knew me better than I knew myself. By the time I reached the park, the city was silent. Not quiet, silent, like the air itself had been sucked out. I stopped, chest heaving, knees weak, and there on the park bench my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I hesitated, staring at it. I knew what would happen if I answered. But something inside me, something desperate, something human, compelled me. I lifted the receiver. 911, what's your emergency? I whispered, voice trembling, static, low, writhing, alive. And then my voice, my own, repeating back to me, please, help me. I dropped the phone again. My hands shook so violently that I could barely stand. And then the whispering started. Not from the phone, not from the static, but all around me. Circling, layered, inhuman, and familiar all at once. Alex, Alex, come to us. The other side? I felt the ground beneath me shift. My vision blurred, and for a moment I swore I could see them. Shapes in the shadows, fleeting, impossible. Faces half-formed, stretching and twisting, watching, patient. They were waiting, and they knew me. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots in the grass. The whispers grew louder, repeating my own thoughts, my own fears, my own voice. You can't escape. You can't escape. I ran blindly into the darkness of the trees. Every step felt heavier than the last. The whispers layered into a crescendo, a chorus of my own voice and theirs, calling me, pulling me in, dragging me closer to something I couldn't see but could feel, cold, alive, and inevitable. And then, silence. I stopped, heart pounding, breath ragged. Nothing moved. Nothing whispered. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I thought I was safe. I thought maybe I had outrun them. Then my phone buzzed again. Unknown number, and I heard it clear and impossibly close. Alex, we're here. I dropped the phone. It landed face up, screen glowing, and there on the screen was me. My face, pale, wide-eyed, terrified, my mouth moving silently, lips shaping the words I couldn't speak, and then the line picked up itself. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But the voice, the whisper, the echo, my own voice, came through, pleading, help me, please. I ran again, faster this time, my legs burning, my lungs screaming. The shadows followed, twisting, crawling, stretching. I felt the ground shift beneath me. Trees bent toward me. Light warped. Every instinct told me to stop, to fight, to scream. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop running from myself. I remember one last thing before I vanished. A whisper right behind my ear. Not on the phone, not in my head, but real, tangible. Alex, welcome to the other side. And then I was gone. That night at the station, the phones rang. A new operator answered. The lines were full. And then one caller, unknown number, screamed into the receiver, MUE, please. Help me, Alex, help me. The operator froze, stared at the screen, and then they listened, because the voice was familiar. Terrifyingly familiar. It was me.